Hello friend, settle in, get comfortable. Tonight we're going inside what a wealthy Victorian widow really inherited the moment her husband died, the mourning rules that took over her whole life. It is one of those topics almost everyone thinks they already understand, and by the end of tonight, I promise you will realise you barely knew any of it. Before we begin, if stories like this one help you drift off, a like or a subscribe genuinely means a lot to me. It tells me you want more nights like this one together. What I would love to know is where you are listening from right now. Maybe you're curled up somewhere in Texas with the air conditioning humming low. Maybe you're in London with a fan turning slowly by the window. Wherever you are, I am glad you're here with me tonight. All right, love. Let your shoulders drop and let your hands rest. Let's go. It does not begin with a funeral. That is the first thing people get wrong about it. It begins with a clock. In the front hall of a tall brick house in Belgravia, in the early spring of 1881, a long-case clock stands against the wall, where it has stood for 11 years, ticking through breakfasts and dinner parties and quiet Tuesday afternoons without anyone paying it the slightest attention. And then, on a particular morning, a housemaid reaches up on tiptoe, opens the little glass door at its face, and stops the pendulum with 2 fingers. She does this because she's been told to. She does this because it is what is done. And she does this, more than anything, because somewhere upstairs, in a bedroom with the curtains still drawn against a sun that has no idea what has happened, a woman named Adelaide Ashford is sitting very still in a chair beside a bed that no longer needs to be shared. Maybe you already know a version of this feeling. Not the exact one, because grief is never exactly transferable, but something in its neighbourhood. The strange stillness that comes after a thing has ended, and the world simply refuses to notice. Her husband, Charles, had gone to bed the night before complaining mildly of indigestion, the kind of complaint a man makes after a heavy dinner and 2 glasses of port, the kind you forget about by morning. He did not wake. The doctor, summoned at 6:30, used the word apoplexy, which is what they called a sudden stroke or a failure of the heart in 1881, a word broad enough to cover several different tragedies and precise about none of them. He was 46 years old. He had built, over 2 decades, a comfortable fortune underwriting marine insurance out of an office near Lloyd's, the kind of work that required him to understand exactly how much risk the world could absorb before it broke, and none of that understanding had done him any good at all when his own heart simply stopped keeping its accounts. Adelaide is 38. She has been married for 16 years, and in the space of one night, without any warning, without any negotiation, without so much as a conversation, her entire legal and financial identity is shifted beneath her, like a floor she did not know was built on hinges. I want to sit with that idea for a moment before we go any further, because it is the thing this whole evening is really about. Not the black dresses, though we will get to those, not the veils and the jet beads and the stopped clocks, though we will get to those too. What we are really talking about tonight is what actually happened, legally and financially and socially, to a wealthy woman in the exact hour her husband died. What she was told she had inherited. What she had actually inherited. And the very large, very quiet gap that so often sat between those 2 things. Here is the part nobody tells you at the start of these stories. In 1881, an Englishwoman's legal existence during marriage was, in the strict language of the common law, suspended. The doctrine was called coverture, from an old French word meaning to cover, and it meant precisely what it sounds like. A married woman did not, in the eyes of the law, exist as a separate legal person from her husband. Her property, unless carefully protected beforehand by a marriage settlement, became his property the moment she said her vows. Her earnings, if she had any, were his. Her legal identity was, as the 18th century jurist William Blackstone had put it in a phrase that Victorian lawyers still quoted a century later, suspended during the marriage, or at least incorporated and consolidated into that of her husband. Which means that the woman sitting in that darkened bedroom, staring at a husband who will never open his eyes again, is about to experience something genuinely strange. She's about to become, in the space of one terrible morning, a legal person again. A widow in Victorian England was called a feme soul, a woman alone, and it was one of the only 2 conditions under which a woman held full legal capacity in her own right, the other being an unmarried spinster of age. She could own property outright, she could sign contracts, she could sue and be sued in her own name, She could, in principle, do almost everything a man could do with money except vote, except sit in Parliament, except practice law or medicine, except a long list of other things we will not get into tonight, because tonight is not for anger, tonight is for understanding. But here is the quiet cruelty folded inside that sudden legal freedom. She gained it in the exact moment she was least equipped, emotionally, to use it. Downstairs, the house is already beginning to move in a pattern it has never moved in before. The butler, a solid and unflappable man named Perrin, who has served the household for 9 years, is standing in the front hall giving instructions in a low voice that carries just enough authority to keep the younger servants from panicking. The knocker on the front door has already been muffled, wrapped in black crepe by the parlour maid, a signal to every tradesman and caller in the street that this house has stopped, for now, receiving the ordinary business of the world. The blinds in the front rooms are being drawn down, not fully, but to what the servants understand, almost by instinct, as half-mast, a position specific enough that visitors passing on the street will know exactly what has happened before a single word is spoken to them. Maybe you find that detail strange, the idea that an entire household could communicate a death through the precise angle of its window blinds. I find myself genuinely struck by it every time I come back to this material. There was a whole silent language built into Victorian mourning, and almost none of it required speech at all. A boy has already been sent running to the offices of Mr. Hertford, the family solicitor, a man Charles Ashford had trusted with his affairs for close to 20 years. Another has gone to fetch the undertaker, a firm on the Brompton Road that the family has used before, for Charles's own father, years earlier. These errands happen with a speed and a practised smoothness that might surprise you, and that is not an accident. Death in a wealthy Victorian household was, in a very real sense, a logistics operation, and the servants of a house like this one had often lived through it before, in other households, under other roofs, and they knew the choreography even when the family upstairs did not. Adelaide does not yet know most of what I am about to tell you. She does not know, sitting in that chair with her husband's hand growing cold in hers, that the house around her, the very walls she's looking at, may not actually belong to her at all. She does not know what her marriage settlement, signed 16 years earlier by her father and Charles's father in a solicitor's office she barely remembers, actually promised her in circumstances exactly like this one. She does not know whether Charles left a will, or what it said, or whether the will and the settlement even agree with each other, which, as we will see, they did not always do. What she knows in this first terrible hour is only the fact of the silence in the room, the absence of the small, ordinary sound of her husband's breathing, which she realizes now she had never once, in 16 years, consciously listened for, because you do not notice a sound until the exact moment it stops. Let us slow down here, because I think it matters. We're going to spend the rest of tonight walking through what actually happened to a woman in Adelaide's position, financially and legally, and socially, in the weeks and months and years that followed a moment like this one. We're going to talk about mourning dress because it was far more regulated and far more expensive than most people realise. We're going to talk about wills and settlements and something called dower, an old rite that was already fading by 1881 but had not entirely disappeared. We are going to talk about the Married Women's Property Act, a piece of legislation that was, at the exact moment of Charles Ashford's death, only partly finished, with its most sweeping version still a year away in Parliament. We are going to talk about what a wealthy widow actually inherited, in hard, practical terms, and how often that turned out to be something narrower and stranger and more conditional than the fortune everyone assumed she now possessed. And we're going to talk about the pressure, from both sides of the family, pulling her in two entirely different directions at once. Her own mother, practical and a little frightened for her daughter's future, quietly hoping for a sensible remarriage that would settle everything again. Charles's brother, watching the estate and the children's inheritance with a different kind of caution altogether, one that had very little to do with Adelaide's happiness and a great deal to do with what a second husband might do to money, that his family still in some private corner of its collective mind considered its own. But first, before any of that, there is the rest of this day to get through. And in 1881, the rest of this particular day is going to be very, very long. By 9 in the morning, Mr. Hartford has arrived at the house, dressed, as solicitors of his generation always seem to be, in a coat slightly darker than fashion strictly required, as though he kept one outfit permanently prepared for exactly this kind of morning. He's shown into the small morning room downstairs, not the grander drawing room, because the grander drawing room has already, without anyone quite deciding it consciously, been designated as a space that will not be used again until the house has finished its formal mourning. Adelaide comes down to meet him still in the dress she slept in, a fact that will strike her later, in quieter moments, as one of the strangest details of the entire day. She had not thought, in the chaos of the early morning, to change. Hartford is kind, in the careful, measured way of a man who has delivered this exact kind of news many times before and has learned, through long practice, precisely how much to say on the first day and how much to leave for later. He tells her that Charles did leave a will, drawn up 9 years earlier and never revised, and that he will need to locate the document and read it formally, likely within the week, once certain other family members have been notified. He tells her gently that there is also the marriage settlement to consider, a separate document from the will, drawn up at the time of the wedding, which governs certain specific provisions that exist entirely outside whatever the will itself says. Adelaide, if I am honest with you, barely absorbs any of this. She nods. She says thank you. She asks one question, quietly, almost embarrassed to be asking it at all, on this of all mornings. She asks whether she will need to leave the house. It is not, on its face, an unreasonable question, and the answer, as it happens, is genuinely complicated, and we're going to spend a good portion of tonight untangling it properly. But Hartford, sensing correctly that this is neither the hour nor the day for a full explanation of jointures and entails, and the difference between real property and personal property under English inheritance law, simply tells her that she need not worry about any of that today. Today, he says, gently closing his small leather case, is for grief, and grief alone. The rest can wait until Thursday. That promise cannot, in truth, hold for quite so long. But it is a kind lie, and Adelaide, sitting alone again in the morning room after he is gone, lets herself believe it for a few more hours. The undertaker arrives just after 11, a thin, quiet man named Mr. Deakins, who has the particular gift, developed over decades in his trade, of being almost invisible in a house of grief. He speaks softly. He moves without seeming to disturb the air around him. He brings with him 2 assistants and a series of items that Adelaide has seen before, at other funerals, other houses, but never quite registered as objects with a price and a purpose until this exact morning. There is the question of the coffin, oak or elm, brass fittings or silver plated, a decision that Adelaide finds she cannot make alone, and defers gratefully to Charles's brother Edmund, who has by now arrived from his own house in Kensington, his face grey with a grief that seems, in these early hours, almost as raw as hers. There is the laying out of the body, which happens upstairs behind a closed door, performed by a woman Deakins has brought specifically for this purpose, a woman who does this work quietly and often, and has, over the years, developed a kind of professional tenderness that Adelaide will remember, oddly, as one of the few genuinely comforting things about this entire day. The mirrors in the bedroom have already been covered, a custom so old that nobody in the house can quite explain its origin, something about not wanting the spirit of the dead to become trapped in its own reflection, or something about simple respect, or something about not wanting to catch your own stricken face by accident while you're trying not to fall apart. The explanations vary depending on who you ask. The practice itself does not. By early afternoon, telegrams have gone out to Adelaide's own mother, still living in the house near Bath where Adelaide grew up, to Charles's sister, married and settled in Yorkshire, to 2 business partners at the insurance office who will need, discreetly and as quickly as possible, to understand what has happened to their colleagues' accounts and his share of the underwriting syndicate he had helped to build. Telegrams in 1881 were expensive, charged by the word, which meant that even news of this magnitude arrived in a kind of clipped economical shorthand. Charles died suddenly this morning. Funeral arrangements to follow. Come if you are able. 12 words to carry the entire collapse of a family's ordinary life. The children come home from their lessons that afternoon and are told in the drawing room, the one room in the house that has not yet been formally darkened, by Adelaide herself, sitting between them on the sofa with one hand on each of their shoulders. There are two of them. Henry, 14, quiet and already, in the particular way of eldest sons, watching his mother's face for some sign of what he is now supposed to feel and how he is supposed to behave, and Louisa, 11, who cries immediately and without restraint in a way that Adelaide finds, in some complicated and slightly guilty corner of her own heart, easier to sit with than her son's careful, controlled silence. Maybe you know a child like Henry, the kind who grieves by becoming very still, very responsible, very grown up, all at once, as though someone has to hold the family together, and he has quietly decided, without anyone asking him to, that it will be him. Here is a detail I find myself returning to, and I want to be honest with you about why. Under the law as it stood in 1881, Adelaide's status as the legal guardian of these two children was not in fact automatic in the way you might assume. The old common law had actually given a father almost total authority over his children during his lifetime, authority so complete that a father could, if he chose, appoint someone other than the children's own mother as their guardian after his death, simply by naming that person in his will. It had taken a series of reforms across the middle decades of the century, beginning with the Custody of Infants Act of 1839 and extended further in 1873, to gradually strengthen a mother's legal claim to her own children in the event of her husband's death. By 1881, if Charles's will named no other guardian, Adelaide would indeed become the sole legal guardian of Henry and Louisa. But the mere need for this to be established through legislation at all, the reality that a mother's right to raise her own children after her husband died was, within living memory, a genuinely contested legal question, tells you something about the architecture of the whole system Adelaide is now standing inside. She does not think about any of this on this particular afternoon. She is thinking about her daughter's shaking shoulders under her arm, and about the particular quality of light coming through the drawing-room window at 4 in the afternoon in early spring, pale and a little grey, the kind of light that makes a room feel like it is holding its breath. That night, the house eats almost nothing. Cook has prepared a light supper out of habit and a sense that the household still needs, in some basic practical way, to function, but almost none of it is touched. Adelaide sits at the table with Edmund and picks at a piece of bread. Neither of them speaks for long stretches at a time, and neither of them minds the silence. Somewhere above their heads, in the room where Charles lies, a single candle burns through the night, tended and replaced by the housekeeper, a small quiet vigil that will continue, without interruption, until the funeral itself, 3 days from now. I want to pause here and tell you something about time, because time behaved strangely in a Victorian house of mourning, in ways that are easy to overlook if you have never sat with the specifics. The funeral could not happen too quickly, because word had to travel, because family had to arrive from Yorkshire and from Bath, and in Edmund's case, simply from across town, and because the elaborate machinery of a proper funeral, the mourning coach, the black horses with their dyed plumes, the printed cards announcing the day and the hour, all of it took real time to assemble. But it also could not happen too slowly, not in an era before reliable embalming was widely practiced among the middle and professional classes, which meant that 3 days, perhaps 4 at the outside, was often the practical limit. Grief, in other words, was forced to move at the speed of logistics, whether it wanted to or not. Adelaide lies awake that first night in a guest room down the hall, unable, and in truth unwilling, to sleep in the bed where Charles died. The window is open a crack, the way the household has always kept it, out of that particular Victorian conviction that fresh night air was essential to good health, and she can hear, faintly, the sound of a hansom cab passing somewhere on the street below, the ordinary rhythm of a city that has not stopped for her loss and never will. She finds this thought, strangely, more bearable than the alternative. A world that kept turning felt, in some small way, like permission to eventually turn with it. The funeral takes place on a Thursday, 4 days after Charles's death, and it is, in every visible way, exactly what a man of his standing was expected to receive. a hearse with glass sides, drawn by black horses whose harnesses are trimmed with black ostrich feathers dyed to match, a slow procession through streets that other households, out of simple courtesy, have already learnt to expect and to make way for. Charles is buried at a cemetery in the western part of the city, in a plot that his own father had purchased decades earlier, under a headstone that will not actually be carved and set for several months yet, because Victorian custom held that the earth needed time to settle before a permanent stone could be safely placed. Adelaide does not attend the burial itself. This detail surprises almost everyone I describe it to, and I remember being surprised by it myself the first time I came across it in a diary from this period. It was, for most of the 19th century, considered improper for the widow of a gentleman to be present at the graveside. The reasoning offered at the time ranged from concern for her physical delicacy in the face of such a shock, to a more genuinely old superstitious anxiety about a widow being present when the earth closed over her husband. Whatever the precise reasoning, the practical result was the same. Adelaide remains at home in the darkened drawing room, while Edmund and Henry, 14 years old and doing his very best to stand like a man, travel to the cemetery to see Charles actually laid in the ground. She will not see the grave itself for several weeks. I find that detail almost unbearably lonely, if I am honest with you. The one ritual most of us think of as the natural, necessary conclusion of a death, the actual moment of burial, closed to the person who needed it most. What she does instead, on the afternoon of the funeral, is receive calls. Not social calls in the ordinary sense, nobody expects conversation or refreshment, but a formal, hushed procession of friends and acquaintances who arrive at the house to leave their cards, edged now in black, and to offer a few quiet words of condolence before withdrawing again. This too has rules, unwritten but universally understood by everyone in Adelaide's social circle. Cards are left with a corner turned down, a small folded signal indicating that the caller has come in person rather than sending a servant. Conversation, where it happens at all, is brief and low-voiced. Nobody stays long. Nobody would dream of asking to stay long. The entire choreography exists to communicate sympathy while making the smallest possible demand on a grieving woman's remaining strength, and there is something, I think, genuinely thoughtful buried inside all that stiff formality, even if it does not always look thoughtful from the outside. Now, let us slow down here for a moment, because this is where the story of Adelaide's mourning really begins in earnest, and it is going to last in one form or another for the better part of 2 years. The mourning dress arrives within the first week, and I want to walk you through exactly what that meant, because the popular image, the plain black dress and nothing more, badly undersells how elaborate, how expensive, and how strictly regulated the whole system actually was. Deep mourning, the first and most severe stage, required a wardrobe built almost entirely around one specific fabric, a stiff, dull, crimped silk gauze called crepe, not the soft, shiny crepe you might picture today. Victorian mourning crepe was deliberately matte, deliberately lightless, treated so that it would not catch or reflect the sun. A woman in deep mourning was meant, quite literally, to absorb light rather than return it to the room. Adelaide's dressmaker, a woman named Mrs. Pargeter, who has clothed the family for a decade, arrives within days with bolts of the material and a face carefully composed into the particular blend of sympathy and brisk professionalism that mourning dressmakers of the period seem to have perfected. The dress itself, for a woman of Adelaide's class, would typically be constructed with a bodice and skirt entirely covered or trimmed in crepe, high at the neck, long-sleeved, with almost no ornament beyond the fabric's own severe texture, no lace, no embroidery, not in these first weeks, no jewellery beyond a narrow category of pieces specifically designed for mourning, which we will get to shortly. And then there is the veil, which deserves its own moment of attention, because it was, in many ways, the single most symbolically loaded object in the entire mourning wardrobe. A widow's veil in the early 1880s was typically made of the same crepe, long enough to fall well past the waist, worn over a small mourning bonnet rather than a fashionable hat. For the first weeks it might be worn down over the face itself when Adelaide left the house at all, which she scarcely did, transforming her into something closer to a shape than a recognizable individual. a deliberate visual statement that the woman underneath had, for the moment, receded from the world. Here is the detail that tends to stop people cold when I describe it, and it stopped me too. The first time I really understood the scale of it. A full deep mourning wardrobe, properly assembled, for a woman of Adelaide's income and social position, could cost the equivalent of what a skilled tradesman might earn in an entire year. Not because black silk was inherently expensive, but because propriety demanded quantity. Day dresses, evening dresses, even though a woman in deep mourning would not be attending evening events, because a hostess might still, in rare circumstances, need to receive close family in her own home after dark. Outdoor cloaks, bonnets, gloves, in a specific matte black kid leather rather than the glossy variety worn in ordinary life. Handkerchiefs edged in black. Stationery too, edged in a border of black ink whose width was itself a coded signal. Wide borders for the earliest, deepest stage of grief, narrowing gradually as the months passed, so that a correspondent receiving a letter from Adelaide could read, from the width of a printed black line alone, roughly how long it had been since Charles died. I want to be honest with you about something. Part of me finds all of this almost absurdly rigid, this idea that grief needed to be measured out in inches of ink and shades of silk, and another part of me, the part that has spent a long time now sitting with these old letters and diaries, finds something quietly moving in it too. In a world with no formal concept of grief counselling, no shared modern language for processing loss, this elaborate system of dress and etiquette gave women like Adelaide a structure to hold on to when almost nothing else in her life felt structured at all. She did not have to decide, every single morning for the first weeks, what to wear or how to behave, or whether it was too soon to see anyone. The rules had already decided for her. There is a particular kind of mercy in that, even if it came wrapped in fabric that must have felt, some afternoons, almost unbearably heavy. The stages of Victorian mourning followed a widely understood, if not perfectly rigid, calendar. Deep mourning, the Crepe stage, typically lasted around a year for a widow, sometimes longer depending on the family's means and inclination. Second mourning followed, allowing the crepe to be gradually reduced and replaced with plain black silk or wool, still sombre, still entirely without colour, but slightly softer in texture and slightly less punishing to wear through a London summer. After that came what was called ordinary mourning, sometimes lasting several more months, in which small amounts of black lace and jet trimming could be added. And finally, half mourning, the last stage before a woman could return to colour at all, permitted shades of grey, mauve, lilac, and a deep muted purple, sometimes called Victorian violet, worn for a further period before, at last, an ordinary wardrobe could be resumed. For a widow specifically, as opposed to a woman mourning a parent or a more distant relative, the total expected period could run to 2 full years, sometimes longer. Queen Victoria herself, as I imagine you already know, mourned her husband Albert for the remainder of her own life, some 40 years, wearing black almost without exception until her death in 1901. Her example, extreme as it was, cast a long shadow over the entire culture of Victorian mourning, holding up a standard of permanent visible grief that most ordinary widows never fully matched, but every widow was, in some quiet way, measured against. Jewellery followed its own careful rules within this system. In deep mourning, a widow could wear jet, a hard, glossy black material formed from ancient fossilized wood, mined most famously along the coast at Whitby in Yorkshire, carved into brooches and mourning rings and long dangling earrings. She might also wear jewellery made, quite literally, from her husband's hair, woven and braided by specialist jewellers into intricate patterns and set behind glass in a locket or a brooch or a bracelet clasp. This practice, which can sound strange or even unsettling to modern ears, was in fact an enormously widespread and deeply sentimental Victorian custom, a way of keeping something physical and permanent from a person who was otherwise entirely gone. Adelaide, in the weeks after the funeral, sits with Mrs. Pargeter's recommended jeweller and selects, from a small folder of samples, a design for a mourning brooch that will hold a small woven curl of Charles's hair beneath an oval of clear glass, rimmed in black enamel. She will wear it, in one form or another, for the rest of her life, long after the crepe and the veils have gone back into storage for good. Now, let us talk about money, because this is the part of the story that most people, understandably, are actually here for, and it is also the part that tends to surprise them the most. The will is read a little under 2 weeks after the funeral, once the immediate family has gathered and the first raw wave of grief has softened just enough for practical conversation to feel survivable. It happens in Mr. Hartford's own office, a wood-panelled room smelling faintly of pipe tobacco and old paper, with Adelaide seated in a chair across from his desk, Edmund beside her, and a clerk quietly taking notes in the corner. This is a formal moment, almost ceremonial in its own quiet way, and everyone in the room understands its weight. Here is where I want to slow down and be genuinely precise, because this is exactly the point where popular imagination and historical reality tend to part ways most dramatically. When people picture a wealthy Victorian widow, they tend to picture a woman who simply inherits everything: the house, the money, the whole visible edifice of her husband's fortune, outright and without condition, the way a modern widow so often does today. That picture is, for the vast majority of women in Adelaide's position, simply wrong. Charles's will, like the wills of most men of his class and generation, does leave Adelaide a great deal, but it leaves her a great deal within a very specific and very deliberate structure, and understanding that structure tells you almost everything you need to know about how Victorian society actually thought about women and money. The first thing to understand is the basic legal distinction between two different categories of property, a distinction that shaped almost every decision in Charles's will. There was real property, meaning land and buildings, the actual physical estate, and there was personal property, sometimes called personalty, meaning everything else: cash, investments, furniture, jewellery, the contents of the house rather than the house itself. English law had for centuries treated these two categories quite differently when it came to inheritance, and that difference did not disappear simply because Charles happened to be a modern professional man rather than a landed aristocrat. That house in Belgravia, it turns out, was never fully Charles's to leave in the first place, not in the sense Adelaide had always assumed. It had been purchased, years before his marriage, with money drawn partly from his own father's estate, and it had been settled through a legal arrangement made at the time of his father's death, so that it would pass automatically to Henry as the eldest son, upon Charles's own death, with Adelaide granted what the law called a life interest, sometimes described more specifically as an estate for life, meaning she has the right to live in the house, to use it, to benefit from it, for as long as she remains alive or until she remarries, depending on the exact wording of the settlement, but she does not own it, she cannot sell it, she cannot leave it to anyone else in her own will. It is not, and never quite becomes, legally hers. I want to sit with that for a moment, because I think it is the single most important fact in this entire story, and it was true for an enormous number of wealthy Victorian widows, not just fictional ones. She had lived in that house for 16 years. She had chosen its wallpaper and hosted its dinners and raised her children within its walls. And in the eyes of the law, she was, from the very hour of Charles's death, essentially a tenant for life in her own home, with the actual ownership already assigned to a 14-year-old boy who would not come into full legal possession of it himself until he turned 21. This arrangement, called an entail in its stricter aristocratic forms, and something closer to a strict settlement in Charles's more middle-class professional version of it, existed for a very specific purpose, and it is worth understanding that purpose, even if you find its effect on Adelaide uncomfortable. The entire system was designed to keep family property intact across generations, to prevent a house or an estate from being broken up, sold off, or redirected outside the bloodline by a widow's second marriage or by simple financial mismanagement. It protected Henry's future inheritance. It also, quite deliberately, limited Adelaide's power over property she had lived inside of for the whole of her adult married life. What Charles's will did give her outright, free and clear, without condition, was a portion of his personal property, the furniture in certain specified rooms, his collection of books, which she had, in truth, always loved more than he did, a sum of money invested in government bonds known as consols, which were considered the safest and most respectable investment available to a Victorian gentleman, generating a fixed and modest but genuinely reliable income, and, most importantly for her day-to-day security, an arrangement called a jointure. And I think this term deserves real explanation because almost nobody outside of specialist historians uses it anymore, was essentially a guaranteed annual income settled on a wife specifically for the event of her widowhood, agreed upon and legally fixed at the time of the marriage itself, long before anyone involved could have predicted when or how the husband might actually die. Adelaide's jointure, negotiated between her father and Charles's father 16 years earlier, had been set at £400 a year, a figure that had felt at the time of her wedding entirely generous and secure. By 1881, with prices having crept upward over the intervening years, and with 2 teenage children still to be clothed and educated, and eventually launched into their own adult lives, £400 a year suddenly feels considerably less generous than it once did. Here is the detail that genuinely stops people cold when I explain it, and it is worth sitting with. £400 a year was, by the standards of 1881, an income that placed Adelaide comfortably among the prosperous middle class, well above the reach of any real hardship. She would keep servants, she would eat well, her children would continue at their schools, but it was a fixed sum, set in a document 16 years old, and it bore almost no relationship at all to the actual scale of the fortune Charles had built since then through his work at the insurance office, a fortune that, on paper, ran to several times that figure. The visible wealth of the household, the house, the carriage, the servants, the sense of ease that had surrounded the family for years, had rested largely on Charles's continuing income from his active business, income that simply stopped in its full form the moment he died. What remained for Adelaide was the jointure, the personal bequests, and her life interest in the house, substantial, comfortable, and considerably smaller, in real practical terms, than the fortune everyone in her social circle, including Adelaide herself, had quietly assumed she now possessed. This gap between the visible wealth of a household during a husband's lifetime and the narrower, more conditional reality of what his widow actually received afterward was so common in Victorian England that it had its own quiet vocabulary among lawyers and family friends. Women spoke of being left comfortable, a phrase that sounds generous and often was not, in any way that matched the life they had grown used to. There is a particular kind of grief hidden inside that phrase, the grief of a woman who must not only mourn her husband, but simultaneously reckon, in the same numb weeks, with the reality that her whole material world has quietly contracted around her. Edmund, sitting beside her in Hertford's office as the will is read aloud, is visibly relieved by its terms, and Adelaide notices this in a small distant corner of her mind, even through her own grief. The house is protected for Henry. The core of the family's capital remains largely intact, invested rather than dispersed. Charles, it turns out, had structured his affairs with exactly this outcome in mind, protecting his son's future inheritance as carefully as he had protected any shipping cargo he had ever underwritten. It is, by the standards of his own time and his own values, a responsible will. It is also, quite plainly, a document written by a man imagining his own death primarily as a problem of continuity for his son and his family name, rather than primarily as a problem of security for his wife. Now, I promised you earlier that we would talk about the Married Women's Property Act, and this is the moment to do it properly, because Adelaide's story sits at a genuinely fascinating hinge point in that legal history. Before 1870, the doctrine of coverture that we discussed earlier meant that almost anything a married woman owned, whether inherited from her own family, earned through her own work, or given to her as a gift, became her husband's legal property the instant she married him, unless a specific and often expensive legal arrangement called a marriage settlement had been drawn up beforehand to protect it. Wealthy families, families like Adelaide's own, could afford solicitors and trust arrangements to shield at least some property for a daughter. Poorer women had no such protection at all, and a working woman's wages, quite literally, belonged in law to her husband, whether he was a kind man or a cruel one, whether he supported his family or drank his way through her earnings in the nearest public house. The Married Women's Property Act of 1870 was the first real legislative crack in this system, though a fairly narrow one. It allowed married women to keep as their own separate property wages and earnings from their own employment, along with certain limited categories of investment income and small inheritances. It did not touch the broader structure of marital property at all. A woman's larger inheritance, her real estate, the bulk of any capital she brought into the marriage, remained, under the 1870 Act, her husband's to control. It would take another 12 years, until 1882, a full year after Charles Ashford's death in our story, for Parliament to pass the far more sweeping Married Women's Property Act that finally, comprehensively, allowed a married woman to own, control, buy, sell, and manage property entirely in her own name, separately from her husband, as though she had never married at all. That later act is in many ways the true legal turning point historians point to when they talk about the end of coverture in England, and Adelaide, widowed in the spring of 1881, becomes a widow in the very last months of the Old World, just before that final legal wall came down. I find that timing strangely poignant, and I want to be honest with you about why. If Charles had lived just one more year, if Adelaide had remained his wife into 1882 and beyond, the law itself would have already begun shifting the ground under their marriage, granting her, even as his living wife, powers over her own property that she had never had before. Instead, she reaches something close to that same legal independence by the older, harsher, more universal route, the one women had always been able to rely on even in the darkest years of coverture. She reaches it through widowhood, the ancient and unhappy loophole in a system that otherwise gave married women almost nothing. Because here is the thing worth remembering, and I think it deserves to be said plainly. However narrow her jointure feels compared to the fortune she had grown used to, however conditional her hold on the house in Belgravia, Adelaide, in the exact moment of her husband's death, gains a form of legal personhood that she did not possess for a single day of her 16-year marriage. She can now, in her own name, sign a lease, open a bank account, enter into a contract with a tradesman without her husband's countersignature, sue a debtor who fails to pay her, manage her own investments, make her own decisions about her own £400 a year without asking permission from anyone. It is a strange, backward kind of freedom, purchased at the highest possible cost, but it is real, and in the months ahead, Adelaide is going to have to learn, from almost nothing, how to actually use it. Let us talk about remarriage now, because it is impossible to understand a wealthy Victorian widow's position without understanding the two very different sets of eyes that were, almost immediately, watching to see what she would do next. Adelaide's mother arrives from Bath about 10 days after the funeral, a small, energetic woman named Mrs. Fenwick, who has outlived one husband of her own, and has, over the intervening years, developed strong and specific opinions about how a woman ought to manage widowhood. She does not raise the subject of remarriage directly, not yet, not while the crepe is still fresh and the grief still raw enough that such talk would be, even by the practical standards of the age, considered genuinely improper. But she raises it sideways, in the careful, oblique way that mothers of every era seem to master instinctively. She asks about Adelaide's finances with a directness that makes Adelaide slightly uncomfortable. She mentions more than once a Mrs. Harrington from their own circle in Bath, who had been widowed at 32 and remarried within 2 years to a solicitor of good standing, and how comfortably, how sensibly, that whole affair had been managed. The subtext, though never once spoken aloud in those first weeks, is not difficult to read. Mrs. Fenwick has lived through widowhood herself, on a smaller income than her daughters, and she knows, with the hard clarity of direct experience, exactly how precarious a widow's comfortable existence can become over time, especially as children grow and their expenses multiply, and a fixed jointure that felt generous in one decade begins to feel thin in the next. Her hope for Adelaide, quiet and unstated but genuinely loving in its own anxious way, is for security. A second marriage, to a man of good character and sufficient means, would restore to Adelaide something the law itself could no longer easily give her, a stable and expanding income rather than a frozen one, and a household run once again by 2 adults rather than one exhausted woman managing everything alone. Edmund's family watches from an entirely different angle, and their concern, though never stated with anything like Mrs. Fenwick's bluntness, is just as real. If Adelaide remarries, Her jointure and her life interest in the house do not typically transfer to a new husband under the specific terms of a settlement like hers. That protection had been carefully written into the original document precisely to prevent such an outcome. But Edmund's real worry sits elsewhere, closer to the children. A stepfather introduced into Henry and Louisa's lives raises, in the anxious Victorian imagination, all sorts of uncomfortable questions about influence, about loyalty, about whether a new husband might, over years of quiet domestic pressure, come to shape decisions that properly belonged to Charles's own bloodline. There is also, if I am honest, a colder financial calculation sitting somewhere beneath Edmund's politeness, one he would never admit even to himself in quite these terms. Every pound that continues to flow toward Adelaide and her children, rather than reverting eventually and more fully to the Ashford family's broader interests, represents money moving, in some sense, away from Edmund's own side of the ledger. I want to be careful here, because it would be easy to make Edmund into a simple villain, and the historical reality of these family dynamics was almost never that simple. Edmund loves his brother's children. He genuinely wants to see Henry grow into a capable, well-settled man, and Louisa married respectably and happily. His caution about Adelaide's remarriage is not, in his own mind, selfish at all. It is simply what responsible stewardship of a family's fortune looked like to a Victorian gentleman, protecting the assets and the bloodline together, as though they were the same obligation wearing two different faces. What almost nobody in either family asks Adelaide directly in these early months is what she herself actually wants, and that omission, more than either the pressure from her mother or the caution from Edmund, is perhaps the truest reflection of how Victorian society actually thought about widowhood. It was in the end considered less a personal life stage to be worked through according to a woman's own feelings, and more a financial and social problem to be solved correctly on her behalf, by the people who loved her and by the structures that governed her. Adelaide, for her own part, in these first raw months, wants nothing of the kind of conversation. She is 38 years old. She has just watched her husband stop breathing in his sleep. The idea of a second marriage feels, to her, not merely premature but almost grotesque, a betrayal of a grief that has not even begun to properly settle. What she wants, more than security, more than the restoration of her old comfortable life, is simply to understand her own circumstances well enough to stop feeling quite so entirely at the mercy of other people's decisions. And so, in the quiet weeks of deep mourning, while she is formally excused from almost all social obligation, confined largely to the house, receiving only the closest family and the most essential callers, Adelaide begins, hesitantly at first, and then with a growing and slightly surprising determination, to actually learn how money works. This is not, I should say clearly, the expected trajectory for a woman of her class and generation. Wealthy Victorian wives were, as a matter of deliberate social design, kept largely ignorant of the practical mechanics of household finance beyond the domestic budget itself. The housekeeping accounts, the servants' wages, the grocer's bills, the larger structure, the investments, the trust arrangements, the actual sources and management of a family's income belonged almost entirely to the province of husbands and solicitors and bankers, a closed conversation that wives were rarely invited into and even more rarely equipped by their own education to fully follow. Adelaide discovers, in her very first proper meeting alone with Mr. Hertford, several weeks after the funeral, just how large that gap in her own knowledge actually is. She does not at first entirely understand the difference between the consols her jointure is invested in and the railway shares that made up a portion of Charles's more speculative personal investments. She does not know, off the top of her head, what her own household's annual expenses had actually amounted to under Charles's management, because Charles, like most husbands of his time, had simply handled the larger bills himself and given her a fixed weekly sum for housekeeping, an arrangement she had never once questioned in 16 years of marriage. Hertford, to his real credit, does not condescend to her. He is in fact quietly impressed by the seriousness with which she begins asking questions, returning to his office again and again over the following months with a small notebook of her own, the kind a schoolgirl might use, filling its pages with figures and terms and careful, slightly uncertain handwriting as she works to understand the actual shape of what she now controls. £400 a year in jointure income. A further sum from Charles's personal bequests, invested conservatively, generating perhaps another £150 annually. The life interest in the house, which costs nothing to hold but also cannot be sold or borrowed against. A kind of wealth that exists only as long as she chooses to keep living inside it. Household expenses that, once she actually sits down and adds them properly, run to something close to £450 a year for the establishment of her size, 7 servants, 2 growing children, a household that maintains, at least outwardly, most of the visible comfort it had always known. The arithmetic, when she finally lays it all out plainly in her small notebook one quiet afternoon in June, is tighter than she had expected, though not frightening. She will manage. She understands, with a mixture of relief and a new, cooler kind of resolve, that she will need to economize in small ways that would have been unthinkable a year earlier. Fewer new gowns, though mourning dress makes that particular economy almost invisible for now. A smaller allowance set aside for entertaining, once entertaining resumes at all. A serious conversation, still some months off, about whether the household truly needs quite so many servants once the initial shock of the transition has settled and the family's real ongoing needs become clearer. I find myself genuinely admiring her in this part of the story, and I want to say that plainly rather than simply implying it. There is something quietly remarkable about a woman who has spent 16 years being deliberately, structurally excluded from the mechanics of her own household's finances, sitting down in her 39th year with a schoolgirl's notebook and a stub of pencil, and simply deciding to learn. Let me pause the story itself for a moment and widen the lens slightly, because I think it helps to understand just how much variation existed beneath the single word widow in Victorian England, and how much Adelaide's own situation, comfortable as it was, still sat well below the very top of that spectrum. If Charles had died without leaving a will at all, which was called dying intestate, Adelaide's position would have looked meaningfully different and generally worse. Under the intestacy laws that governed England through most of the 19th century, a widow whose husband died without a will was entitled to a portion of his personal property, though the exact share depended on whether there were surviving children, and to what was called dower, an ancient right dating back centuries, entitling her to a life interest in 1/3 of her husband's freehold real estate. Dower had, by the 1880s, become a somewhat weakened and often deliberately avoided right, since many marriage settlements were specifically drafted to bar dower in favour of the more modern and more flexible jointure arrangement, precisely the kind of settlement Adelaide's own father had negotiated on her behalf. But for women lower down the economic ladder, women whose husbands died without the money or the foresight to arrange a proper settlement at all, dower and intestate inheritance were often the only protection the law provided, and that protection was, by any modern standard, thin. At the other end of the spectrum sat a small number of genuinely extraordinary Victorian women, widows and heiresses whose fortunes and whose freedom to manage them dwarfed anything in Adelaide's own comfortable but bounded life. Angela Burdett Coates, who inherited an immense banking fortune from her grandfather rather than a husband, but whose life illustrates the outer edge of what a wealthy Victorian woman with real independent capital could actually accomplish, spent decades of her own life funding hospitals, schools, and housing projects across London, becoming one of the most significant philanthropists of the entire century, a woman whose name appeared in newspapers not as somebody's widow or somebody's daughter, but simply, remarkably, as herself. Her example, and others like it, tell us something important. The legal and social structures we have been describing tonight were real, and they were genuinely limiting, but they were not absolute walls. Money, enough of it, combined with sufficient determination and frankly sufficient social standing to weather a certain amount of raised eyebrows, could still buy a Victorian woman a version of real agency in the world, even inside a system built, in most of its details, to discourage exactly that. Adelaide is not Angela Burdett Coates. Her £450 or so a year places her among the comfortable professional gentry rather than among the handful of genuinely independent female fortunes of the age. But the underlying truth holds at every level of the scale. from the grandest heiress in London down to a widow of far more modest means in a provincial town. However narrow or wide her particular version of it, widowhood handed a Victorian woman a door that marriage had kept firmly closed, and what she did once she walked through that door depended enormously on her own resourcefulness, and rather a lot, if we are honest, on the specific quality and honesty of the men, solicitors, bankers, estate agents, who now had to deal with her directly rather than through a husband. And that part of the story, the actual mechanics of a widow learning to be taken seriously by the professional men who managed money in Victorian London, deserves its own attention, because it was rarely simple. Adelaide's first real experience of this comes about 2 months after the funeral, when she visits the bank herself, alone, for the first time in her life, to discuss the transfer of certain accounts into her own name following the will's formal probate. She has dressed carefully for the occasion, in her deep mourning black, veil lowered, and she arrives at the counter with a letter from Hertford confirming her legal standing to conduct this business. The junior clerk who first attends her is polite but visibly uncertain, glancing more than once toward a closed office door, as though hoping a more senior colleague might materialize to take this transaction off his hands. When the branch manager, a Mr. Selwyn, does eventually appear, he is courteous, even warm, but he addresses much of the conversation, out of what seems to be pure habit, rather than any deliberate rudeness, toward a spot slightly to Adelaide's left, as though a husband or a solicitor were standing there and simply had not yet spoken. It is a small thing. It happens quickly and is smoothed over by Adelaide's own calm, direct answers to his questions, answers that, within a few minutes, visibly recalibrate his sense of who exactly he is dealing with. But she notices it, and she will notice it again, in smaller and larger forms, throughout the coming years, this reflexive assumption among men of business that a woman managing her own money is, at some level, an anomaly requiring quiet correction or careful handling, rather than simply a client like any other. Stay with me here, because this detail matters more than it might first appear. It was not usually outright hostility that Victorian widows faced when they stepped into the world of finance and property management. It was something subtler and, in its way, more exhausting, a low, steady current of surprise and doubt that had to be overcome, transaction by transaction, meeting by meeting, until a woman had proven, often several times over to several different men, that she was entirely capable of understanding her own affairs. Adelaide proves it. Gradually, the way most capable people prove most things, not through any single dramatic moment, but through simple accumulated competence. She learns to read a balance sheet well enough to catch a small error in the estate accounts that even Hertford's own clerk had initially missed, a misallocated dividend payment worth £11 that nobody but Adelaide herself ever bothers to notice or correct. She learns, over the course of that first year, which of the household's expenses are genuinely necessary and which had simply calcified into habit under Charles's management, discovering, for instance, that the household had been paying for a subscription to 2 separate newspapers that arrived each morning, one of which nobody had actually read in months. Small things, the kind of detail that never makes it into grand historical accounts of Victorian widowhood, and the kind of detail that, I think, tells you far more about what this actual experience felt like from the inside than any of the larger legal facts we have already covered. By late summer, roughly 6 months after Charles's death, the household has settled into a new and quieter rhythm. The deepest phase of mourning is easing, gradually, into its second stage. The crepe begins to be reduced, though not eliminated, replaced in part by the somewhat softer black silk that marks the transition. Adelaide begins, cautiously, to receive a slightly wider circle of callers again, though she still declines every invitation to dine out, every suggestion of an evening engagement, anything that might be seen, even by the most generous interpretation, as premature. Louisa returns to her lessons with a governess. Henry, preparing for his own eventual entry into the world his father had built, begins spending occasional afternoons at the insurance office near Lloyd's, shadowing one of his father's old business partners, a slow, deliberate introduction to a professional world that will, one day, likely become his own. And Adelaide, in the evenings, after the children are settled and the house has gone quiet, continues to sit with her small notebook, adding to it steadily, month after month, a growing and increasingly confident record of her own financial life. She has begun, tentatively, to make small independent decisions about her investments, following Hertford's advice closely at first, then gradually, as her own understanding deepens, offering her own opinions and occasionally, to Hertford's quiet and genuine approval, pushing back against a recommendation she has come, through her own reading and her own arithmetic, to disagree with. By the first anniversary of Charles's death, in the early spring of 1882, something else has quietly happened in the wider world that will matter, in a slightly indirect way, to Adelaide's own story. Parliament passes the Married Women's Property Act of 1882, the sweeping version we spoke of earlier, finally granting married women across England the right to own and control property entirely separately from their husbands, as though coverture, that old suffocating doctrine, had simply never existed at all. Adelaide reads about it in the newspaper one quiet morning over her tea, and she finds herself sitting with the notice for a long moment, turning it over in her mind. It does not change her own legal position at all, not directly. She is already, and has been for a full year now, a feme soul, already free to hold and manage property in her own name in a way the new act is only just extending to married women for the first time. But she thinks, reading it, of her own daughter, 11 years old and growing steadily toward an adulthood that will now unfold, whatever else happens, under a fundamentally different legal architecture than the one Adelaide herself was married into. If Louisa marries one day, and her own marriage settlement is drawn up carelessly, or not drawn up at all, the new act means that whatever property she brings into that marriage, whatever she inherits afterward, whatever she might one day earn through her own labour, will remain hers, protected by statute rather than dependent on the particular skill of a family solicitor 16 years before the fact. Adelaide finds this thought, strangely, one of the more comforting developments of her entire first year of widowhood, even though it changes nothing whatsoever about her own immediate circumstances. I want to pause on that reaction for a moment, because I find it genuinely touching. So much of what we have discussed tonight is about the narrow, conditional, often frustrating shape of what Adelaide herself actually inherited. And here, a full year into her grief, one of the moments that brings her something like quiet satisfaction is not about her own gain at all, but about a small widening of possibility for her daughter, a future she will not fully live to see unfold, but has, in her own careful way, already begun preparing Louisa to meet. The anniversary itself passes quietly. Adelaide visits the grave, now marked with its permanent headstone, for the first time in months, standing alone for a while in the cool spring air before Henry and Louisa join her. She had ordered the stone herself, choosing the wording with Hertford's gentle assistance, a simple inscription giving Charles's name and dates, and a short line from Scripture that he had, she remembered, always found genuinely comforting rather than merely conventional. Standing there, she finds that the sharpest edge of the grief has softened into something else, something heavier and quieter, and in its own strange way, more bearable, not less love, just less immediate pain attached to that love. That same spring, something else begins, tentatively to develop. And here is where the story of remarriage pressure that we touched on earlier returns, this time in a more concrete form. A man named Mr. Aldous Whitfield, a widower himself, a solicitor of solid reputation and comfortable, though not spectacular means, begins calling on the household with increasing regularity. He is a friend of Edmund's, introduced originally through a shared professional connection, and he is, by every outward measure, precisely the sort of second husband both Adelaide's mother and, somewhat to Adelaide's surprise, even Edmund himself might reasonably approve of, kind, steady, financially secure without being so wealthy that his motives would invite any real suspicion, a father himself, to 2 children close in age to Henry and Louisa, which gives their conversations, when he does call, an easy, natural warmth that has nothing forced about it at all. Adelaide likes him. I want to be honest about that, because it would be simpler in some ways to tell this story as one of straightforward independence triumphing cleanly over old-fashioned pressure, and the truth, as it usually is, sits somewhere more complicated than that. She enjoys his company. She finds herself, on the evenings he calls, genuinely looking forward to the conversation, to a kind of easy adult companionship she has not had, if she is honest, in longer than she quite likes to admit even to herself, because Charles, in the last busy years of his life, had often come home too tired from the insurance office for much conversation at all. But here is the thing that surprises even Adelaide herself, sitting with it quietly through the summer of 1882, when she actually turns the question over, seriously, in the privacy of her own mind, weighing what a marriage to Mr. Whitfield might actually mean for her own life. She finds herself hesitating in a way that has very little to do with any lingering grief for Charles, and a great deal to do with something else entirely. She has, over the past 16 months, built something for herself that she is genuinely reluctant to hand back over to anyone, even a kind and steady man she likes a great deal: the small leather notebook, the direct, unmediated conversations with Hertford and with Selwyn at the bank, the quiet daily authority of being the person, the only person, who decides how her own household is run and how her own modest fortune is managed, under the terms of her own marriage settlement to Charles, and under most settlements like it. A remarriage would not strip her of the jointure or her life interest outright. That protection had, as we discussed, been carefully built into the original document, but it would, in the ordinary practical shape of a Victorian marriage, hand the active management of her affairs back into a husband's hands, almost automatically, not necessarily by any explicit legal requirement in every case, but by the simple accumulated weight of social custom and expectation that a wife, even a wife with her own protected income, generally deferred to her husband's judgment on matters of business. Mr. Whitfield, kind as he is, has never once, in all his calls, asked Adelaide a single question about how she manages her own investments. He has assumed, without unkindness, without even really noticing the assumption, that this is simply not the sort of thing that would interest her, or that she would be capable of discussing, and that gap, small as it sounds when I say it plainly like this, turns out to matter enormously to Adelaide once she actually names it to herself. She does not refuse him dramatically. There is in truth no formal proposal at all, not yet, only a slow gradual cooling of the frequency of his calls once Adelaide begins, gently and without ever quite explaining her full reasoning, to redirect their conversations away from any hint of a shared future and back toward the safer, easier ground of ordinary friendship. Mr. Whitfield, to his real credit, takes the hint with grace and without any wounded pride that Adelaide can detect, and their families remain friendly for years afterward, their children occasionally crossing paths at the same parties, and eventually the same weddings, though never quite each other's. Her mother is disappointed, in her own quiet way, when the possibility fades without ever quite becoming an actual event to be disappointed about. Edmund says almost nothing on the subject at all, though Adelaide suspects, correctly as it happens, that his own feelings are considerably more mixed than her mother's, a certain relief at the continued security of Henry's eventual inheritance sitting alongside a genuine, if quietly expressed, concern for his sister-in-law's long-term happiness and companionship. Adelaide herself, turning 40 that autumn, finds that she does not especially regret the choice, though she allows herself, on certain quiet evenings, a small wistful thought about what a different kind of companionship might have felt like. What she has instead, and what she finds herself, somewhat to her own surprise, genuinely valuing, is a life that belongs entirely to her own decisions for the first time since she was a very young woman. She chooses which investments to hold and which to sell, in consultation with Hertford, but increasingly on her own settled judgment. She chooses how the household budget is allocated, trimming one small luxury here, permitting a slightly larger one there, according to priorities that are at last entirely her own rather than negotiated or deferred. She chooses, when the time eventually comes, how Louisa's own future marriage settlement will be drafted, insisting, over the mild surprise of the family solicitor handling that particular document years later, on protections and clauses considerably more generous to her daughter than the ones Adelaide's own father had thought to request on her behalf, all those years ago, in a solicitor's office she barely remembers now. Let me take you back into the house itself for a while, because I think the legal and financial details, important as they are, can only tell you half of what this life actually felt like from the inside. The other half lives in smaller things, the particular sound the house makes at different hours, the weight of a certain door, the quality of silence in a room built for 8 people that now, most evenings holds only 3. By the second winter of her widowhood, Adelaide has moved into what the mourning calendar called ordinary mourning, the stage that permits small amounts of black lace and jet trimming back into a wardrobe that had spent nearly 2 years in unrelieved black wool and silk. The dressmaker, Mrs. Pargeter, arrives one November afternoon with a small selection of fabric samples in deep violet and soft grey, the colours of half mourning, still months away for Adelaide but close enough now that it makes sense to begin planning. Adelaide finds herself turning the swatches over in her hands by the window, surprised at the strength of her own reaction to them. Not joy exactly, something quieter and stranger, a kind of cautious anticipation, the way you might feel testing weight on a leg that has been in a splint for a very long time. The house at night, by this point in the story, has developed its own particular rhythms, ones that Adelaide has come, almost without noticing, to know intimately. The coal fire in the drawing room is banked down around 10 each evening by the parlour maid, its low orange glow the last visible light in that part of the house until morning. The long case clock in the hall, restarted some weeks after the funeral once the household judged that enough time had passed, ticks through the small hours with a steadiness that Adelaide finds, on the hardest nights, oddly comforting, proof that at least one thing in the house continues moving forward at exactly the same pace it always has. Perrin locks the front door at 10:30 precisely, a small ritual sound, the particular scrape and click of that specific bolt that Adelaide has come to associate, somewhere below conscious thought, with the safe closing of another day. She has learned, over these 2 years, to read the house the way she has learned to read a balance sheet, understanding its small signals, its particular needs, in a way she genuinely never had to when Charles was alive, and much of that domestic management, though nominally her responsibility as mistress of the house, had still moved within a structure he ultimately oversaw, and, in a quiet, unspoken way, underwrote. Now the entire weight of it sits with her alone. When the cook comes to her with concerns about the price of coal rising faster than the household budget can comfortably absorb, there is no husband's study to knock on for a final decision. Adelaide sits with the household ledger herself, at her own writing desk, working out where a small saving might be found elsewhere to offset it, perhaps in the frequency of the laundress's visits, perhaps in a slightly less elaborate arrangement of flowers for the hall table, small quiet economies that nobody outside the household will ever notice or need to know about. I find myself thinking, when I read through diaries and letters from women in exactly this position, about how much genuine skill this kind of management actually required, and how completely that skill went unrecognized by the wider culture around them. A man managing an insurance syndicate, weighing risk against premium, deciding which ships and which cargoes were worth the exposure, was understood by everyone including himself to be engaged in serious intellectual work. A widow managing a household budget against a fixed income, understanding exactly how many months a reserve would last if a servant fell ill and needed to be replaced, or if the roof needed unexpected repair, or if a daughter's coming presentation to society required an outlay that had not been fully planned for, was understood by almost everyone, including often herself, to simply be doing what women do. The skill was identical, the recognition was not. There is a particular evening, in the early part of that second winter, that Adelaide will remember for years afterward, though nothing dramatic happens in it at all. It is a Tuesday. The children are both upstairs, Henry working through some Latin translation at his own small desk, Louisa already asleep. Adelaide sits alone in the drawing room, the fire low, a cup of tea gone cold beside her elbow, working through a decision Hertford has brought to her that week regarding a modest investment opportunity in a new railway extension being built somewhere in the industrial north. It is not, in the scale of things, an enormous decision. A few £100, carefully considered against the safer, more familiar comfort of her existing consoles. But she sits with it seriously, the way Charles himself might once have sat with a much larger underwriting decision at his own desk near Lloyd's, weighing the risk, reading through the prospectus Hertford has left with her twice, making a small column of figures in her notebook, comparing the guaranteed but modest return of the government bonds against the higher but genuinely uncertain return of the railway shares. She decides, in the end, against the railway, judging the risk not worth the marginal gain for a household that depends so entirely on steady, predictable income rather than the possibility of larger but less certain returns. It is, I think, a genuinely small moment in the larger sweep of this story, and it is also, I think, exactly the moment worth lingering on, because it captures something that no single dramatic scene, no funeral, no reading of a will quite manages to capture on its own. This is what independence actually looked like, in its daily, unglamorous, entirely ordinary form, not a grand declaration of freedom. A woman sitting alone by a low fire on an unremarkable Tuesday evening, making a careful, competent, entirely her own decision about a few £100, and getting it, by every measure that later years will confirm, exactly right. The servants, over this same period, have their own quiet adjustment to make, and it is worth spending a moment on their perspective too, because a household's transition into widowhood was never only the widow's experience alone. Perrin, who had served under Charles's direction for 9 years before his death, finds himself, in the months following, reporting to a mistress rather than a master for the very first time in his career, and he manages the adjustment with the same steady, unflappable competence he brings to everything else, though Adelaide notices, in small ways, a slightly greater formality in his manner toward her than he had ever shown toward Charles, a certain careful correctness that she comes to understand, over time, as his own way of signalling respect for a position he is still, in some quiet corner of his professional mind, adjusting to seeing a woman occupy so completely. Mrs. Doyle, the cook, a broad, capable woman who has run that kitchen for over a decade, adapts rather more easily, having always, in truth, dealt more directly with Adelaide than with Charles on the actual daily business of running the house, menus and marketing, and the management of the kitchen maid beneath her. If anything, Mrs. Doyle finds Adelaide, in this new period, a somewhat more engaged and more curious mistress than she had been before, asking questions now about the actual cost of certain ingredients, the actual arithmetic of feeding a household of this size, that she had never troubled to ask when such details had simply been absorbed, unquestioned, into a larger household budget managed elsewhere. Spring returns, as it does, and with it the full transition into half-mourning, the final stage before Adelaide's wardrobe can at last return to ordinary colour after 2 years of black and grey and muted violet. Mrs. Pargeter's shop delivers a dress in a soft dove grey, trimmed with narrow bands of lilac, and Adelaide stands in front of her own looking-glass for a long moment, genuinely startled by how strange it feels to see herself in anything other than black. 2 years is a long time to wear a single colour, long enough that the absence of it, when it finally comes, feels almost like undressing in public. The formal re-entry into society, when it happens, is handled with the same careful, unhurried etiquette that governed everything else in this process. There is no single dramatic evening where Adelaide simply reappears at a ball, fully restored to her old social life as though nothing had happened. Instead, the return unfolds gradually, almost imperceptibly, across a series of small steps that anyone watching closely would have been able to read as clearly as they had once read the angle of the drawn blinds. First, calls resume, morning visits to close friends, brief and quiet, much as they had been in the earliest weeks of mourning, but now conducted in half-mourning grey rather than deep unrelieved black. Then, small quiet gatherings, an afternoon tea with 4 or 5 old friends rather than a proper dinner party. Then, finally, nearly 2.5 years after Charles's death, Adelaide hosts her first proper dinner for 8, a modest, careful affair, the dining room lit again with its full complement of candles, rather than the reduced, subdued lighting that had marked every household event since the funeral. I want to tell you about the calling cards specifically, because they carry a small linguistic detail that I find genuinely charming, in a slightly melancholy way. A widow of Adelaide's era, once she began circulating in society again, would often have her cards printed with a specific and rather old-fashioned word attached to her name, relict, an antique term meaning literally the one left behind, used to distinguish a widow formally from a married woman or a spinster in the strict social taxonomy of the period. Mrs. Charles Ashford, relict of the late Charles Ashford, Esquire. It sounds strange to modern ears, almost clinical, and yet there is something in it that Adelaide, turning her own new cards over in her hands the first time Mrs. Pargeter's printer delivers them, finds she does not entirely dislike. It names, plainly and without any attempt at softening, exactly what she is, the one left behind, still standing, still unmistakably here. Here is the part of this story I think is worth pausing on properly, because it is easy, telling it this way, to make Adelaide's experience sound almost universal among Victorian widows, and it very much was not. Everything we have discussed tonight, the jointure, the life interest in a substantial London house, the careful solicitor managing a diversified portfolio of consols and railway shares, belong to a genuinely narrow slice of Victorian society, the comfortable professional and mercantile classes, families with enough capital to draft careful marriage settlements in the first place, and enough ongoing income to weather a husband's death without falling, even temporarily, into real hardship. The far larger number of Victorian widows lived an entirely different story, one with almost none of the legal protections we have spent this evening exploring. A working-class widow, the wife of a dock labourer or a factory hand or a small shopkeeper, faced her husband's death with none of the cushioning a jointure provided, no life interest in a comfortable townhouse, often no will at all because there was simply nothing substantial enough to require one. For these women, widowhood frequently meant an immediate and often desperate scramble for income, taking in laundry, taking in lodgers, sending children out to work far earlier than any family would have chosen under better circumstances, applying, in the worst cases, to parish relief or to one of the era's grim and deeply feared workhouses. The poor law system that governed relief for the destitute drew no meaningful distinction between a widow who had simply fallen on hard times through no fault of her own and any other category of pauper, and the stigma attached to accepting parish relief was severe enough that many widows endured genuine privation rather than seek it. I mention this not to diminish anything we have discussed about Adelaide's own experience, because her grief was real, and her constraints, though narrower than they might first appear, were genuinely limiting in their own way. I mention it because I think it matters, when we tell stories like this one, to hold both truths at once. Adelaide's world was constrained by a legal system that treated her for most of her married life as something closer to an extension of her husband than a full independent person, and Adelaide's world was also unmistakably a world of enormous privilege compared to the vast majority of women who found themselves widowed in the same decades, women whose stories rarely made it into diaries or letters at all because they were too busy simply surviving to write any of it down. That gap between the wealthy widow's narrow but real freedoms and the working widow's near total lack of any safety net whatsoever is itself one of the most revealing facts about how Victorian society actually organized itself around gender and money. It was never simply that women as a category were denied financial independence. It was that financial independence, where it existed at all for a widow, was almost entirely a function of the capital her family and her husband's family had accumulated and protected on her behalf before she ever needed it, a privilege inherited rather than a right universally granted. Adelaide, to her considerable credit, comes to understand this herself over the years, and it shapes in small but genuine ways how she chooses to spend some of her own eventual surplus income. By the time Louisa is approaching her own debut in society, several years further into this story, Adelaide has quietly begun contributing, in modest but regular sums, to a charitable society in London dedicated to assisting the widows and orphans of men who had worked, in various capacities, within the shipping and insurance trade her own husband had belonged to, a small but deliberate acknowledgement, never spoken about openly even to her own children, of exactly how much of her own comfortable position had rested on circumstances of birth and marriage settlement, rather than anything she had personally earned. Let us move forward now, several years further into this story, to a moment that I think brings almost everything we have discussed tonight into a single, quiet, genuinely emotional focus. Henry turns 21 in the spring of 1888, 7 years after his father's death, and with that birthday comes the formal legal transfer we mentioned much earlier in this story, the moment at which the strict settlement governing the Belgravia house finally, fully vests in him as its true legal owner, rather than the shadow ownership he has technically held since his father's death as a minor who could not yet take actual possession. Adelaide's own life interest does not disappear on this day. Not exactly. The settlement had been carefully drafted to allow her continued residence for as long as she wished it, but the underlying legal reality shifts in a way she feels. Even though almost nothing about her daily life actually changes, the house is now, in the fullest and most complete sense, her son's. She lives in it now not as a widow holding her rightful place, but, in the strictest technical language of the law, as a mother residing at the invitation and by the continued goodwill of her own child. I want to be honest with you about how strange this moment is, because it deserves to be sat with rather than rushed past. Henry himself, to his own considerable credit, handles the transition with a grace that genuinely moves his mother. There is no formal ceremony, no dramatic reading of documents this time, simply a quiet conversation one evening in the drawing room where Hertford, now considerably greyer than he had been 7 years earlier, explains the legal particulars to both of them together, and Henry, 21 years old and already carrying something of his father's steady, careful manner, turns to his mother almost immediately afterward and tells her, without any prompting from anyone, that nothing in the household will change, that this house has always felt like hers to him regardless of what any document says, and that he hopes she will go on living in it for as long as she wishes, for the rest of her life if that is what she wants. Adelaide, sitting there in the room where she once heard her husband's own will read aloud 7 years earlier, finds herself unexpectedly close to tears, not from any anxiety about her own security. Henry's promise, she knows, is entirely genuine and will be entirely honoured, but from the strange, layered emotion of watching her own son step, in this one formal moment, fully into the legal shoes his father once occupied, becoming, in the eyes of English law, the actual master of a house his mother has run alone, competently and completely, for the better part of a decade. There is something in that worth noticing, and I do not think it needs a tidy conclusion to land properly. A woman spends 7 years as the sole practical authority over a household, making every real decision about its finances, its servants, its daily rhythms, its future, and then watches the legal ownership of that same household pass, by an arrangement made before she was even a widow, into the hands of a 21-year-old who has, in the most literal sense, never run a household day in his life. Henry knows this, I think, on some level, even as he receives the formal transfer with such easy grace. He has watched his mother manage everything for years. He is not stepping into an empty role. He is stepping into a role his mother has already, quietly and without any legal recognition at all, been performing the entire time. The practical arrangement that follows reflects this reality more than the strict letter of the settlement ever could. Henry, still finishing his own training at the insurance office and not yet remotely ready to actually run a household of this scale, defers to his mother's judgment on almost every domestic matter exactly as he always has, formally asking her opinion on decisions that are now, technically, his alone to make, a small daily courtesy that costs him nothing and means, Adelaide suspects, though he would likely deny it if asked directly, rather a great deal to both of them. It is not until several years later, when Henry marries and brings his own young wife into a household that has by then, quietly and without any single dramatic turning point, become genuinely his to run, that Adelaide finally makes the decision, entirely her own, to move into a smaller house nearby, a comfortable, well-appointed place in a quieter square not far from the old family home, purchased outright with her own accumulated savings and a portion of the capital that had, over the years, grown steadily under her own careful management. This decision, when she finally makes it, has nothing to do with being pushed out, nothing to do with any tension in the household, and everything to do with something Adelaide has come, slowly, over the better part of a decade, to genuinely value. A house that is entirely, unambiguously, without any settlement or entail or life interest attached to it at all, simply and completely her own. I find this detail, more than almost anything else in Adelaide's story, the one that stays with me the longest. After 7 years of managing a house she could never fully own, after 2 years of grief measured out in inches of black crepe, after a marriage settlement drafted by men who had never once imagined her as anything more than a provision to be made rather than a person to be consulted, Adelaide, at 45 years old, finally purchases a house with her own name, and only her own name, on the deed, no entail, no life interest that expires or transfers, no inheritance protected for a son who has never asked whether he wanted the protecting, simply a small, comfortable, well-proportioned house, chosen entirely according to her own taste, in a square she has always found quietly beautiful in the late afternoon light, bought and paid for and held, at last in the fullest and most complete legal sense, by herself alone. Louisa's story unfolds alongside her brother's, and it is in its own way even more directly shaped by everything her mother learned in those first hard years of widowhood. She makes her formal debut into society at 18, in the spring of 1889, presented at a series of the modest but respectable gatherings that made up the London season for a family of the Ashfords' particular standing, not grand enough for a presentation at court, but entirely sufficient for a young woman to be properly introduced into the marriage market of her own social class. Adelaide watches this whole elaborate process unfold with a complicated mixture of feelings, some genuine pleasure in her daughter's evident happiness, a little wistfulness for her own long-past debut, and something sharper and more watchful underneath both of those, a determination that whatever happened to Louisa in the years ahead, it would not happen to her the way it had so nearly happened to Adelaide herself, without full understanding, without any real voice in the arrangements being made on her behalf. When a suitable young man does eventually emerge, a barrister named Frederick Colby, steady and well regarded, and Adelaide judges after careful observation over more than a year of courtship, genuinely fond of Louisa rather than merely fond of her family's connections, the marriage settlement negotiations that follow look almost nothing like the ones that had governed Adelaide's own wedding 25 years earlier. She insists, over the mild surprise of the young solicitor Frederick's own family has engaged, on reviewing every clause herself, in detail, rather than leaving the matter entirely to the men involved, as her own father had once done on her behalf. She insists, specifically, on a jointure figure considerably more generous, proportionally, than her own had been, adjusted with a hard-won practical understanding of exactly how much a household's expenses could grow over a decade or two of rising prices and growing children, and she insists, perhaps most significantly of all, given that the Comprehensive Married Women's Property Act had by now been law for several years, that Louisa's own separate property, whatever she brought into the marriage and whatever she might inherit afterward, remain unambiguously and explicitly her own, protected not merely by the older, more limited mechanism of a marriage settlement, but by the fuller statutory protection the law itself now provided. Frederick's family finds this degree of maternal involvement in a marriage settlement somewhat unusual, and one or two mildly pointed comments are made, in Adelaide's hearing and once or twice not quite far enough out of it, about a widow perhaps being overly cautious, overly involved, in matters that had traditionally been the business of fathers and solicitors rather than mothers. Adelaide, by this point in her life, has developed a fairly settled and unbothered relationship with exactly this kind of comment. She smiles, thanks them for their concern, and continues asking precisely the questions she intends to ask, in precisely the detail she intends to ask them, until every clause of the settlement satisfies her own careful judgment, rather than anyone else's comfort with how a widow is supposed to behave. I find myself genuinely moved by this part of the story, and I want to tell you why. There is a very direct, very traceable line running from a woman sitting alone with a schoolgirl's notebook in the first raw months of her own grief, working out for the first time in her life the actual difference between a console and a railway share, all the way to that same woman 25 years later, sitting across a table from a barrister's solicitor and insisting, clause by clause, on protections for her daughter that nobody had thought to insist on for her. Grief, in Adelaide's case, produced competence, and competence, over the long unhurried arc of a life, produced something even more valuable than the money itself, a determination to make sure the next generation of women in her family would never again have to learn these lessons quite so late, quite so alone, or quite so entirely from scratch. Let me widen the historical lens once more here, because there is a piece of this financial picture we have not yet fully discussed, and I think it belongs in this part of the story specifically, alongside Louisa's own settlement, since it concerns exactly the kind of careful calculation both women, mother and daughter, are now engaged in. Probate duty, a tax levied on personal property passing at death, had existed in various forms throughout the Victorian era, and it represented another layer of cost that a family like the Ashfords needed to account for in the immediate aftermath of Charles's death, a detail that rarely makes its way into popular accounts of Victorian inheritance, but mattered a great deal to the actual arithmetic involved. The rates varied according to the value of the estate and the relationship of the beneficiary to the deceased, with spouses and children generally taxed at lower rates than more distant relatives or unrelated beneficiaries. But the duty still represented a real and sometimes significant reduction in what actually reached a widow's hands compared to the estate's total value on paper. Hertford had in fact spent a considerable portion of that very first formal meeting in his office, back in the spring of 1881, walking Adelaide and Edmund through exactly this calculation, explaining which portions of Charles's estate would be subject to duty, and at what rate, a conversation Adelaide had barely been able to follow at the time, through the fog of her own fresh grief, but one she would return to, and finally, fully understand only many months later, rereading Hertford's careful written summary, with a clearer head and a considerably more educated eye. By the time Louisa's own settlement is being negotiated, Adelaide understands this landscape well enough to raise it herself, unprompted, asking Frederick's solicitor directly how the proposed settlement accounts for the eventual duty that would apply to whatever capital passed to Louisa and her own children in the fullness of time. A question that visibly catches the young solicitor slightly off guard, not because it is an unreasonable question, but because it is not, in his experience, a question that mothers of the bride typically think, or are expected, to ask. Let me slow everything down now, because I want to spend some time simply inside Adelaide's later life, in the small quiet house in the square she chose for herself, rather than continuing to move briskly through dates and documents. This part of the story does not need urgency. It needs only your attention and the low light of wherever you are lying right now. Her new house is smaller than the old one, 4 floors instead of 5, no separate morning room and drawing room, but a single comfortable parlour that serves both purposes, and she finds, somewhat to her own surprise, that she prefers it this way. There is less to manage. Fewer rooms to heat, fewer servants to direct, fewer decisions demanded of her in any given week. She keeps 3 servants now instead of 7, a cook, a housemaid, and a manservant who doubles as coachman when she wants the small carriage brought round, and the household runs with the kind of quiet, well-oiled ease that only comes from years and years of practiced competence on every side. A typical morning, in these later years, begins around 7, when her maid draws the curtains and brings a small tray with tea and a single slice of toast, a habit Adelaide developed sometime in her 50s and has never seen any reason to abandon. She reads for perhaps half an hour before rising properly, usually something substantial rather than light. She has developed, over the years, a genuine taste for serious history and for the newer realist novels that some of her old friends find slightly too frank for polite taste, though Adelaide herself, having spent 2 decades now managing her own money and her own affairs without any man's oversight at all, finds she has very little patience left for the idea that certain subjects are simply unsuitable for a lady's attention. She dresses, with her maid's help but with far less elaborate ceremony than the mornings of her younger married life once required, in colours now, soft blues and warm browns, and, on days when she feels like it, a deep green she has always privately considered her best shade, mourning having ended in every visible sense for decades, though she still, without ever quite deciding to, keeps that small oval mourning brooch with Charles's woven hair beneath its glass close at hand, pinned most days to whatever she is wearing, a quiet private thread connecting this whole long independent life back to the man whose sudden death, all those years ago, is the reason any of it came to exist at all. Breakfast is taken alone most mornings, at a small table in the parlour with the morning paper propped against the teapot, a habit that would have seemed almost scandalously solitary to the young bride she once was, surrounded always, in those early married years, by the constant social choreography of a much larger household. She has come to genuinely treasure this particular hour, the quiet, unhurried privacy of it, coffee or tea going slowly cold while she reads through the financial pages with the same easy fluency she now brings to everything involving money, checking the performance of her own modest but carefully diversified portfolio, noting a dividend here, a shift in railway share prices there, the whole familiar language of it as natural to her now as embroidery had once been, and considerably more useful. The mornings themselves are given over to correspondence and to the small ongoing business of her own financial life, letters to Hertford's successor at the firm, a younger solicitor now that old Hertford himself has retired to a cottage in Kent, letters to her charitable society regarding the Widows' and Orphans' Fund she has quietly supported for years, letters to Louisa, who lives now with Frederick and their own growing family in a comfortable house not far away, and letters to Henry, whose own household has in its turn grown to include 3 children who call Adelaide, with great and genuine affection, simply grandmother, without any of the formal distance that might once have characterized a Victorian grandmother's relationship with the youngest generation. Afternoons vary. Some are given to calls, the old formal choreography of Victorian visiting having softened considerably by now into something closer to genuine friendship among women who have known each other for decades, who no longer need the elaborate rules of card leaving and precisely timed visits, because the relationships themselves have grown sturdy enough to bear a more casual weight. Some afternoons are given to her garden, a small but carefully tended square of green behind the house, where she has developed, somewhat late in life, a genuine passion for roses, spending long contented hours with her gloves and her shears among the beds she designed herself, a private domain that requires no consultation with any solicitor or any son, that answers to nothing but sun and rain and her own patient attention, and some afternoons, still, even now, are given to the ledger. She has never quite lost the habit begun in that first raw spring of widowhood, the small leather notebook long since retired to a drawer, but its function continued in a proper bound account book, kept with a precision that would, she sometimes thinks with a private, slightly wry amusement, have genuinely surprised the younger version of herself who once could not have told a console from a common share. The evenings, when she is not dining with Louisa's family or Henry's, are quiet, and this is the part of her day I find myself wanting to describe most carefully, because I think it holds something genuinely worth sitting with. She takes her supper early, alone, at the same small table, and afterwards settles into the single deep armchair by the parlour fire with whatever book she is currently reading, a cat, acquired somewhat impulsively a few years back from a neighbour's litter, and named, with a private joke only she fully understands, Jointure, curled somewhere nearby on the hearth rug. The fire burns low. The clock on the mantel, a smaller and plainer piece than the old long-case clock from the Belgravia house, but kept to precisely the same careful time, ticks through the hour with its own steady, undemanding rhythm. There is a particular kind of silence in that room, in those evening hours, that Adelaide has come, over the decades, to genuinely love rather than merely endure. It is not the frightened, hollow silence of that very first night, all those years ago, lying awake in a guest room, unable to sleep in the bed where Charles had died. It is something else entirely, something closer to peace, the settled, unhurried quiet of a life that belongs, in every particular, entirely to the woman living it. I want to go back now, briefly, to those very first weeks of deep mourning, because there is a piece of the mourning industry itself that I skipped over earlier, and I think it deserves its own moment, because it tells you something genuinely fascinating about just how thoroughly Victorian commerce had organised itself around grief. There existed, by the middle of the 19th century, entire specialised establishments in London devoted exclusively to outfitting a family for mourning. The most famous of them, a large emporium on Regent Street called Jay's General Mourning Warehouse, which had opened decades before Charles's death and had by the 1880s become something close to an institution, the destination every fashionable London family turned to in the first disoriented days after a death in the household. A woman like Adelaide, or more likely her housekeeper acting on her behalf in those very first numb days, could send word to a warehouse like Jay's and receive, within a remarkably short time, an entire ready-assembled mourning wardrobe delivered directly to the house, dresses in a range of standard sizes for immediate wear, while more carefully fitted pieces were being made up by the family's own dressmaker, along with black-bordered stationery, black-edged handkerchiefs, mourning jewellery samples, black gloves in several sizes, even black-bordered playing cards and black sealing wax, every conceivable object a household might need to visibly and correctly announce its grief to the world. all available for purchase in a single efficient transaction. I find something almost startling in the scale of that commercial infrastructure, the sheer scope of an entire retail industry built specifically around death, and I think it is worth pausing on because it changes how you understand the whole apparatus of Victorian mourning we have been discussing tonight. This was not simply a set of private customs that individual families worked out for themselves in the privacy of their own grief. It was a fully commercialized system with its own catalogues, its own seasonal considerations, its own etiquette manuals published specifically to guide anxious families through exactly which fabric was appropriate for exactly which stage of loss. Books with titles like Guides to Etiquette and Correct Mourning Practice circulated widely among households of Adelaide's class, laying out, in exhaustive and sometimes genuinely absurd detail, precisely how many months a widow should wear crepe before transitioning to silk, precisely which relatives warranted a full year of mourning, and which warranted only a matter of weeks, precisely how a widow's stationery border should narrow, month by careful month, as her grief was permitted, by social consensus, to visibly lessen. Now let me tell you about one more piece of the legal architecture, because it connects directly back to everything we discussed earlier about marriage settlements, and I think it deserves its own explanation, since it shaped the very document that protected Adelaide's own jointure in the first place. There existed, within the more sophisticated marriage settlements of the period, a legal device called a restraint upon anticipation, a clause specifically designed to protect a married woman's separate property from being seized, sold in advance, or pledged as security for debts, even by the woman herself, and certainly by any future husband looking to get his hands on capital that had been carefully set aside for his wife's protection alone. This clause, invented by equity lawyers over the course of the 18th century specifically to close a loophole that unscrupulous husbands had been exploiting for generations, meant that even property nominally under a married woman's own control could not be signed away, mortgaged, or otherwise anticipated before its scheduled payment, protecting her, in effect, from her own potential husband's financial recklessness or outright manipulation. It is a strange, almost paradoxical piece of law when you sit with it properly. The restraint upon anticipation existed, fundamentally, because the legal system understood, quite clearly, exactly how vulnerable a married woman's property could become once it passed under her husband's practical control. And rather than address that vulnerability by simply granting women fuller independent legal capacity across the board, the law instead constructed an elaborate protective cage around specific sums of money, a cage that could only be built by wealthy families with access to skilled solicitors capable of drafting it correctly in the first place. Adelaide's own jointure had been protected by exactly this kind of clause, a detail Hertford had explained to her carefully in those early meetings, and it meant that even if she had gone on to marry Mr. Whitfield or any other man, her £400 a year would have remained genuinely hers, untouchable by any husband's creditors or any husband's own financial mismanagement, a small but real fortress built into the settlement 2 decades before anyone involved could have known how much it might one day matter. The Dower Act of 1833, passed nearly half a century before Charles's death, is worth mentioning here too, because it fundamentally altered the older, more automatic right of dower we touched on earlier, the ancient entitlement to a life interest in 1/3 of a husband's freehold land. Before this act, dower had been a right a wife held automatically, one that a husband could not easily bargain away even if he wished to, attaching itself to virtually any freehold land he owned during the marriage, regardless of what a marriage settlement said. The 1833 Act changed this significantly, allowing a husband to bar his wife's dower rights through his will or through other legal arrangements, effectively shifting the balance of power firmly toward whatever a couple, or more accurately whatever their respective fathers, had negotiated in a marriage settlement, rather than relying on the older automatic protections of common law. By the time Adelaide married Charles in 1865, dower in its old automatic form had become, for families sophisticated enough to draft proper settlements, largely a formality superseded by the more flexible and more thoroughly negotiated jointure arrangement, exactly the kind of arrangement that shaped her own eventual widowhood. I tell you all of this, I realize, in some detail, and I want to be honest about why. It would be easy to tell Adelaide's story as a simple, clean narrative, a wealthy widow who grieved and then triumphed, learning independence through hardship in a satisfying arc. And there is real truth in that arc, I think, genuine truth in the way she grew, over years, into a woman fully capable of managing her own life. But the actual legal machinery underneath that story, the dower acts and the restraint upon anticipation clauses and the careful, deliberate distinctions between real property and personal property, between a life interest and outright ownership, tells a more complicated truth. Adelaide's independence was never simply a triumph of her own character, though her character mattered enormously. It was also, in a very real sense, a product of privilege carefully engineered by lawyers working on behalf of her family, generations of legal innovation designed specifically to protect wealthy women from the worst excesses of a legal system that otherwise gave married women almost nothing at all. Her freedom was real. It was also, in its origins, entirely conditional on money that had nothing to do with her. Let me tell you about a Christmas, because I think a single specific holiday, described properly, tells you more about how this whole long story eventually settles than any further discussion of legal statutes ever could. It is Christmas of 1894, 13 years after Charles's death. Adelaide is 51 years old. She spends the day, as she has for some years now, at Henry's house, the old Belgravia townhouse, still standing exactly where it always has, though the drawing-room wallpaper has changed twice since Adelaide's own tenure there, and the nursery upstairs, once Henry and Louisa's own, now holds 3 small children of the next generation entirely. Henry's wife, a warm, capable young woman named Cecilia, who took to the running of that large household with an ease that genuinely impressed Adelaide from their very first meeting, has organized the day with a competence that reminds Adelaide more than a little of her own younger self, though Cecilia has had the considerable advantage of a mother-in-law willing to actually teach her the practical mechanics of managing a household budget, rather than leaving her to work it out entirely alone. Louisa arrives at midday with Frederick and their own 2 children, and the house fills, over the course of the afternoon, with a noise and warmth that Adelaide, sitting quietly in a comfortable chair near the fire with a cup of tea and a small grandchild eventually settling, uninvited but entirely welcome, into her lap, finds herself simply, quietly, enjoying without any particular need to analyze the feeling further. There is a version of this story where a woman who lost her husband suddenly at 38 spends the rest of her life defined primarily by that loss, and there is another version, the truer one as it happens, where grief becomes, over enough years, simply one thread woven into a much larger and more varied fabric, present always, visible if you look for it, but no longer the whole pattern. She thinks of Charles that day. Of course she does. She thinks of him every Christmas, a small private moment usually taken alone sometime in the late afternoon, when the children have been sent off for their naps and the adults have a rare quiet half-hour before the evening meal, when Adelaide slips quietly into whatever room is currently empty and allows herself, briefly, to remember him properly. Not the sudden shock of that first terrible morning. That memory has softened considerably over 13 years, worn smooth the way grief eventually does if you are fortunate enough to survive it long enough. What she remembers instead, more often now, are smaller, gentler things. The particular way he used to hum, slightly off-key, while reading the newspaper. The specific weight of his hand on her shoulder during a difficult dinner party, years before his death. A small silent signal of reassurance that she had somehow, at the time, taken entirely for granted. The sound of his voice, which she can still hear clearly if she concentrates, though she has noticed, with a small private sadness she has never mentioned to anyone, that the exact timbre of it has begun, very slowly, to blur at the edges of her memory, the way sounds do when there is no longer any living voice to refresh them against. There is an old friend of hers, a woman named Mrs. Thornbury, also widowed, though considerably less fortunate in her own late husband's financial arrangements, who joins Adelaide for tea most Thursdays in the small parlour of Adelaide's own house. Mrs. Thornbury's husband had left her with no jointure at all, only a modest annuity purchased late in his life that has, over the years, proven barely sufficient to maintain even a small household with a single servant, and Mrs. Thornbury's own widowhood, Adelaide has come to understand through years of quiet Thursday conversations, has been a considerably harder road than her own, marked by genuine financial anxiety in a way Adelaide's careful jointure and her own eventual competence at managing it had largely spared her. Adelaide never speaks of this difference directly, it would be. She understands instinctively a genuine unkindness to draw explicit attention to it, but she finds small quiet ways over the years to ease her friend's circumstances without ever making the assistance feel like charity, an invitation to dine that saves Mrs. Thornbury a week's grocery bill, a carefully chosen gift at Christmas that happens to be something genuinely useful rather than merely decorative, a quiet word to her own solicitor recommending a small, safe investment that might, over time, improve her friend's own precarious annuity income. These small kindnesses, I think, tell you something important about who Adelaide has actually become across this long story, a woman who understands, with real and hard-won clarity, exactly how much of her own comfortable independence rests on circumstances entirely outside her own control, and who chooses, quietly and without any need for recognition, to extend some portion of that fortune outward to a friend who was simply less lucky in the particular shape of her own husband's death. The years continue to move, the way years do, gathering speed in that peculiar fashion where each individual day feels unhurried, and yet whole decades seem to pass between one Christmas and the next, almost without her noticing. Henry's children grow, Louisa's children grow, old Hertford dies, peacefully, in his cottage in Kent, and Adelaide attends his funeral, with a grief that surprises her with its genuine depth. This man who guided her through the very worst weeks of her own life, patient with a grieving, largely ignorant young widow in a way that shaped more than she ever fully told him, the entire competent, independent woman she eventually became. Mrs. Thornbury dies too, some years later, and Adelaide finds herself at the funeral, standing quietly beside the coffin of a woman whose entire widowhood had been shaped by a legal and financial reality so much narrower than Adelaide's own, and she thinks, standing there in the cold, that the accident of one man's foresight in drafting a marriage settlement decades earlier had, in the end, meant the difference between two entire lives. There is one more historical moment I want to fold into this story before we let it rest, because it arrives, in Adelaide's own timeline, at a point when she is old enough to feel its full weight, and it connects directly back to everything we discussed at the very beginning of tonight's story. In January of 1901, Queen Victoria dies at Osborne House on the Isle of Wight, at the age of 81, having reigned for 63 years and having spent the last 40 of them in a mourning so complete, so unrelenting, that it had shaped the entire visual and emotional culture of an era that would eventually take her own name. Adelaide, by this point 58 years old herself, follows the news with an attention that surprises even her own family a little, spending several days reading every newspaper account she can find of the elaborate state funeral that follows, the black-draped streets of London, the enormous slow procession, the whole nation, in its own vast collective way, performing exactly the kind of formalized public grief that Adelaide herself had once performed privately in a much smaller house, nearly 20 years earlier. She thinks, reading these accounts, about the strange symmetry of it. Victoria had lost her own husband, Prince Albert, in 1861, 20 years before Charles's death, and had never once, in the 4 decades that followed, fully emerged from mourning in the way etiquette technically prescribed, wearing black for the rest of her long life, a choice that had, over those decades, hardened from personal grief into something closer to a permanent national symbol, an entire monarchy quite literally dressed in the widow's weeds of its own sovereign. Adelaide had worn her own black for 2 years, following the calendar that etiquette manuals and mourning warehouses like Jay's had carefully laid out, and had then, deliberately and without any guilt she can locate looking back on it now, returned to colour and to an ordinary life. She wonders, reading the accounts of Victoria's funeral, whether the old queen had ever found in her own permanent mourning something of the same quiet structure and purpose Adelaide had once found in her own briefer version of it, or whether, for a woman who never had to build a new independent life the way Adelaide had been forced to, the black simply became easier to keep wearing than to ever take off. It is an odd thing, mourning a monarch you never met, while quietly measuring your own much smaller, much more private history of loss against hers, and Adelaide finds herself doing exactly that for several strange, reflective days in that cold January, an entire nation's grief, somehow making her own decades-old grief feel, briefly, freshly present again, the way anniversaries sometimes do even when the date itself carries no particular personal significance. The new century arrives with the new king, and London, and England more broadly, begins, gradually and unevenly, to loosen some of the rigid formality that had governed so much of Adelaide's own younger life. The elaborate mourning customs we spent so much of tonight discussing, the specific stages, the crepe and the jet and the careful narrowing of a black-bordered letter, begin, over the following decade, a slow and genuine decline, never disappearing entirely but softening considerably, worn with far less universal rigour by the young women of Louisa's own daughter's generation than it had ever been worn by Adelaide herself. Adelaide watches this shift with a complicated mixture of feelings, a little wistfulness for a set of customs that had, whatever their genuine burdens, given her own early grief a shape and a structure to hold on to, and a real, considered relief that the young widows of the coming century will not be required to disappear behind a crepe veil for the better part of a year the way she once had. She visits Charles's grave less often now, not from any lessening of feeling but simply from the ordinary erosion that time works on even the most carefully tended rituals. Once a year, on the anniversary, still, faithfully, walking the familiar path to the now weathered headstone with its careful inscription, standing there for a while in whatever weather the particular spring has brought that year, and finding, each time, that the visit feels less like grief and more like a kind of quiet, companionable check-in with an old and permanently absent friend. She tells him things, sometimes, standing there alone, small updates about Henry's growing business, about Louisa's own children beginning their own advances into adulthood, about a rose in her own garden that finally bloomed properly this year after 3 disappointing seasons. She does not believe, in any strict theological sense, that Charles hears any of it. She does it anyway, because the habit itself has become, over 20 years, its own small comfort, a private thread connecting the whole long unlikely span of her own independent life back to the single sudden morning that started it. I think this is a good moment, before we settle fully into the quiet close of tonight's story, to gather up everything we have walked through and hold it together for a moment, not as a summary exactly, more as a kind of resting point, the way you might pause on a landing halfway up a long staircase. What did a wealthy Victorian widow actually inherit the moment her husband died? Not the fairy tale version, the one where a grieving woman simply receives her husband's entire fortune and steps seamlessly into his place. The real version, the one we have spent tonight inside of, was almost always something narrower, more conditional, and more carefully engineered than that. She inherited, in Adelaide's case and in the case of countless women like her across the wealthier reaches of Victorian society, a jointure, a fixed annual income negotiated years or even decades earlier, in a marriage settlement drafted by men on her behalf, sometimes generous relative to the standards of its own time, and sometimes, as prices rose and family needs grew, considerably less generous by the time she actually needed to rely on it. She inherited, very often, not outright ownership of the family home, but a life interest in it, the right to live there, to benefit from it, for as long as she remained a widow, or as long as she lived, while the actual legal ownership passed, quietly and immediately, to a son who might still be a child, protected by an entail or a strict settlement designed, above almost everything else, to keep the family's core property intact across generations, rather than to secure his mother's own long-term comfort. She inherited, alongside these narrower financial provisions, a sudden and genuinely significant expansion of her own legal personhood, the shift from a married woman whose very legal existence had been, under the old doctrine of coverture, absorbed into her husband's, into a feme soul capable of owning property, signing contracts, and managing her own affairs entirely in her own name, a form of independence that a great many Victorian women, married and comfortable and quietly frustrated in equal measure, might genuinely have envied, even as it arrived, for every single widow who ever received it, wrapped in the worst possible circumstances a woman could imagine. Alongside all of that, She inherited an elaborate, expensive, and strictly regulated set of expectations about how her grief must look to the outside world, a calendar of crepe and silk and slowly narrowing black borders that would govern nearly 2 years of her wardrobe, her social calendar, and her visible public identity, expectations that could feel, depending on the day and depending on the woman, by turns genuinely comforting in their structure and genuinely suffocating in their rigidity. And she inherited, whether she wanted it or not, a family on either side newly and intensely interested in her future marital status, her own relatives hoping, often out of genuine love mixed with genuine practical anxiety, for a sensible remarriage that would restore a familiar kind of security, and her late husband's relatives watching, with a different and more protective kind of anxiety, to make sure that whatever she decided did not disturb the careful arrangements already made for the next generation's inheritance. What separated a woman like Adelaide from the vast majority of Victorian widows, women whose stories rarely survive in any detail at all because they were too busy simply surviving to leave much of a written record behind, was never really the presence or absence of grief. Grief, as far as anyone can tell, respected no particular income bracket. What separated her was the quality and foresight of the legal protection her family had been wealthy enough to purchase on her behalf, years before she ever needed it, a jointure carefully calculated, a restraint upon anticipation quietly built into the settlement, a solicitor competent and honest enough to explain the whole tangled structure to her clearly once she finally, in her own grief, found the strength to ask. I keep turning this whole story over in my mind, to that image of Adelaide in the very first days of her widowhood, sitting in a solicitor's panelled office, asking the one question that actually mattered to her in that raw moment, whether she would need to leave the house. It is such a small, practical, human question, and the honest answer, the one Hertford was too kind to give her in full that particular afternoon, was genuinely complicated, tangled up in 3 centuries of English property law, in doctrines with names like coverture and dower and entail, in a whole invisible architecture that had been built, brick by careful legal brick, long before Adelaide was ever born, and that would go on shaping the lives of women very much like her for decades after her own story reached its quiet, comfortable, independent end. Let us go back one final time into that small quiet parlour, because I want to leave you there, in that specific room, rather than in any solicitor's office or any crowded Christmas gathering. It is an evening in the autumn of 1908. Adelaide is 65 years old. 27 years have passed since that cold spring morning when a housemaid reached up on tiptoe and stopped a pendulum with 2 fingers. 27 years since a widow's veil first fell across a young woman's face in a darkened bedroom in Belgravia. The house she sits in now is not that house, has not been that house for nearly 2 decades, and yet something of its rhythms, its particular quality of evening quiet, feels to Adelaide entirely continuous with everything that came before it, the way a life sometimes does when you have finally stopped fighting its shape and simply learnt, instead, to live comfortably inside it. The fire is low, the way it always is by this hour. Jointure the cat, considerably older now himself, grey around the muzzle in the particular way old cats get, is curled on the hearth rug in his usual spot, occasionally opening one eye when a log settles and shifts in the grate. Adelaide's hands, resting on the arms of her chair, show their age now in a way that would have seemed impossible to imagine on that first morning, all those years ago, when she sat in a different chair beside a different bed and watched her whole life reorganize itself in a single silent hour. She wears a shawl now, most evenings, a soft grey wool one that Louisa knitted for her 2 winters ago, and she has found, to her own quiet amusement, that she has become exactly the kind of comfortable, settled, slightly formidable old woman that she once, as a young bride of 22, would have looked at across a drawing-room, with a mixture of respect and mild apprehension. Louisa visited that afternoon, bringing her youngest daughter, a bright, curious girl of 9 named Evelyn, who has recently discovered, to Adelaide's genuine delight, an interest in numbers that reminds her, more than she has ever quite told anyone, of her own late-blooming fascination with ledgers and investments all those decades ago. Evelyn had sat on the parlour floor for the better part of an hour that afternoon, working through a small set of sums Adelaide had set her, not out of any formal lesson, but simply because the girl had asked, genuinely asked, whether her grandmother might teach her how money actually worked, a question that had struck something quiet and deep in Adelaide, remembering her own younger self, 38 years old, and entirely ignorant of the difference between a console and a common share, having to learn everything from nothing in the worst possible circumstances a woman could be handed. She had answered Evelyn's questions carefully, patiently, the way old Hertford had once answered her own, and had felt, watching the girl's small, serious face bent over the figures, a particular kind of satisfaction that she has come, over the years, to recognize as one of the deepest and most reliable pleasures still available to her at 65. Not triumph exactly, something quieter than that. The simple, accumulating satisfaction of watching a hard-won piece of knowledge pass, freely and without any of the difficulty it once cost her, into younger hands that will, she hopes, never have to learn it quite so late or quite so alone. The evening settles further as the light outside the window fades toward true dark, the particular deep blue of an autumn evening in London, gas lamps beginning to glow along the square outside, their light catching, faintly, on the dew already forming on the last of the season's roses in her small garden. Adelaide sits with a book she is not, if she is honest with herself, actually reading, the pages open on her lap, while her attention drifts instead through the whole long unlikely span of everything that brought her to this exact chair, this exact fire, this exact quiet, settled evening. She thinks, sometimes, on evenings like this one, about the young woman she used to be, the wife who never once in 16 years of marriage thought to ask what her own household actually cost to run, who deferred every financial decision to a husband she loved genuinely and completely, and who had, without any particular unkindness, simply never imagined her as someone who might need or want to understand such things for herself. She does not resent that younger self, or the husband who shaped her into that particular kind of comfortable ignorance that would be, she has come to feel, a genuine misreading of a marriage that was, in almost every other respect, a happy and a loving one. But she notices, all these years later, the strange gift buried inside the worst thing that ever happened to her. The way Charles's sudden death, terrible as it was, terrible as it remains even now in the quiet corners of her memory, where she still, occasionally, allows herself to properly miss him, had also, almost accidentally, handed her an entire second life she would never otherwise have had reason to build, a life of her own competence, her own decisions, her own small, hard-won, thoroughly earned authority over her own affairs. I think this is, in the end, the real shape of the story we have spent tonight inside of, and I want to say it plainly rather than leaving it entirely for you to work out on your own. Adelaide's widowhood was never a simple triumph, and it was never a simple tragedy either. It was something more complicated, and I think more genuinely human than either of those tidy shapes. A woman handed a devastating loss and a narrow, conditional, carefully hedged form of independence in the very same terrible hour, who spent the better part of 3 decades, slowly, patiently, turning that narrow, conditional freedom into something real, something entirely her own, something no marriage settlement or entail or restraint upon anticipation had ever specifically designed or intended her to build, and building it anyway. The clock on the mantel strikes 10, its small, familiar chime the same one she has heard, some version of it, every evening for longer than she can now easily count. Somewhere upstairs, her maid is already turning down the bed, warming it, perhaps, with the flat brass warming pan Adelaide has never quite been persuaded to give up in favour of the newer hot water bottles some of her friends now swear by. Jointure stretches on the hearthrug and resettles himself with the particular unhurried confidence of a cat who has never once in his entire comfortable life had to worry about who owns the house he sleeps in. Adelaide closes her book, finally, without having read more than a few pages of it, and sits for one more quiet moment in the firelight, watching the last of the flames settle into the deep orange glow of embers that will keep the room gently warm long after she has gone up to bed. She thinks, one final time this evening, of a long case clock in a front hall that no longer belongs to her, of a housemaid's careful fingers stopping its pendulum on a cold spring morning nearly 30 years ago, of a black veil and a schoolgirl's notebook, and a small oval brooch with a curl of hair beneath its glass, still pinned, as it has been pinned most days for nearly 3 decades, close against her heart. She rises, slowly now, the way 65-year-old knees insist on rising after a long evening in a comfortable chair, and makes her way toward the stairs, one hand trailing lightly along the familiar banister of a house that is, in every particular, in every deed and document and quiet daily decision, entirely and unmistakably her own. Let me take you back a little, to a year I have not yet told you about, because I think it belongs in this story too, and because it shows you something the quiet later chapters cannot quite capture on their own, namely what Adelaide's independence actually cost her, and what it looked like when that independence was genuinely tested, rather than simply exercised in calm and comfortable circumstances. It is 1890, 9 years into her widowhood. Adelaide is 47, and that autumn, a major financial crisis breaks across the city of London, centred on the near collapse of Baring Brothers, one of the great merchant banking houses of the age, brought to the edge of ruin by a series of disastrous investments in Argentine bonds that had, over the preceding years, seemed to nearly everyone involved like perfectly sound and respectable investments. The crisis, when it finally breaks in November of that year, sends a genuine shock through the entire financial world Adelaide has spent the better part of a decade quietly, carefully learning to manage, and it arrives at her own front door in a far more direct and frightening way than she could have anticipated. A meaningful portion of her own more speculative holdings, the modest additional investments beyond her core protected jointure that she had built up gradually over the years through her own increasingly confident decisions, had been placed, on the recommendation of Hertford's own successor at the firm, in South American railway bonds, bearing a close and uncomfortable relationship to exactly the kind of paper now collapsing in value across the city. For nearly 2 full weeks that November, Adelaide does not know, with any real certainty, how much of that portion of her savings will survive the crisis intact. I want to describe this period honestly, because it is easy, telling a story like Adelaide's, to make her later competence sound as though it arrived smoothly and without genuine fear along the way. And that would not be a true account of what actually happened. She is frightened that November, in a way she has not been frightened since the earliest, rawest weeks of her own widowhood. She lies awake at night doing the same anxious arithmetic she once did in that very first spring, working out, over and over, exactly how far her jointure alone, protected as it is by its careful restraint upon anticipation, would stretch if the more speculative portion of her savings simply vanished entirely. It would stretch far enough, she calculates grimly, to keep the household running, to keep Louisa's education and Henry's continuing training funded. But it would mean the end of certain comfortable margins she has, over 9 years, quietly come to rely on, without fully noticing she was relying on them. What she does, in the middle of that crisis, tells you a great deal about the woman she has become by this point in the story. She does not simply wait, passively, for Hertford's firm to tell her what has happened to her investments. She goes to the office herself, twice in 1 week, sitting across the desk from a considerably more junior solicitor than old Hertford, who by this point has begun handing more of his routine business to younger colleagues, and she asks direct, specific, informed questions about exactly which of her holdings carry exposure to the crisis, exactly what the firm's own assessment is of how deep the losses might run, and exactly what options exist for limiting further damage if the situation continues to worsen. The young solicitor, a man named Pruitt, who has not previously had much direct dealing with Adelaide's account, finds himself, by the end of that first meeting, genuinely startled by the sophistication of her questions, later remarking to a colleague, in a comment that eventually makes its way back to Adelaide herself and gives her a private, satisfied smile, that Mrs. Ashford understood the situation rather better than several of his gentleman clients had managed to. The crisis, as it happens, resolves itself more gently than the worst fears of that November suggested it might. The Bank of England, working with a consortium of other major banks, organises a rescue that prevents Barings from collapsing outright, and the wider financial panic, though genuinely severe for several tense weeks, does not produce the total catastrophic collapse that some of the more alarmed voices in the city had predicted. Adelaide's own South American railway bonds recover a meaningful portion of their value over the following 2 years, though not all of it, and she absorbs a real, if not devastating, loss on that portion of her portfolio, a loss she takes as a genuine and useful lesson rather than simply an unlucky accident to be forgotten. She makes a decision, in the aftermath, that she holds to for the rest of her financial life. She reduces, permanently, the proportion of her savings held in anything resembling speculative foreign investment, however attractive the promised returns, keeping the great bulk of her holdings, from that point forward, in the same steady, unglamorous government consols that had always anchored her jointure in the first place, supplemented only by a small, carefully limited allowance for more adventurous investment that she reviews personally, in detail, at least twice a year, rather than simply leaving to whichever solicitor happens to be handling her account at the time. I find this episode, small as it is in the larger sweep of Adelaide's life, genuinely important to the story, because it shows you something the quieter, more settled chapters cannot quite demonstrate on their own. Real independence, the kind Adelaide had been slowly building for 9 years by this point, was never simply about the absence of a husband managing her affairs. It was about the presence of genuine, tested judgment that had to survive actual pressure, actual uncertainty, actual fear, before it could be called anything more than untested confidence. The bearing crisis gave Adelaide exactly that test, at exactly the moment in her widowhood when she had grown comfortable enough to perhaps have needed one, and she met it, not perfectly, not without real anxiety, but competently, directly, and with a clear-eyed honesty about her own losses that many far more experienced men of business, watching their own fortunes shrink that same November, entirely failed to manage. There is a detail from that period that Louisa, years later, long after she has grown into an adult with her own settled understanding of money, likes to tell her own children, a small family story passed down the way such stories are, slightly polished with each retelling but true in its essential shape. Louisa remembers, at 13 years old, that autumn of 1890, coming down to breakfast one particularly tense morning during the crisis, and finding her mother already at the table, the financial pages spread before her, entirely calm, entirely composed, working through the morning's figures with the same steady attention she brought to every other ordinary Tuesday. Louisa had asked, with the direct bluntness of a worried 13-year-old, whether they were going to lose the house. Adelaide, without looking up from the newspaper, had told her daughter, simply and firmly, that they were not, that she had already worked out exactly what would need to happen if the worst came to pass, and that Louisa need not spend one more moment of her own morning worrying about it. It was not, strictly speaking, entirely true in that exact moment. The full picture was still genuinely uncertain when Adelaide said it, but it was, I think, the kind of necessary and loving fiction that a competent parent tells a frightened child. And it was also, importantly, a fiction resting on real underlying substance, real calculations already worked through in a small leather notebook the night before, rather than simply an empty reassurance offered to quiet an anxious daughter. Adelaide had, by that point in her widowhood, become exactly the kind of person capable of making that particular distinction between comforting words and comforting words backed by genuine, careful preparation. And it is, I think, one of the clearest measures we have, across this entire long story, of just how far she had actually travelled from the woman who once sat in a solicitor's office, still in the dress she had slept in, unable to absorb even the most basic outline of her own financial circumstances. Before we let this story settle into its final quiet close, I want to widen the lens one more time, up toward the very top of Victorian society, because the word widow covered an enormous range of experience even among wealthy women, and Adelaide's own comfortable but bounded circumstances sat, as we discussed earlier, closer to the middle of that range than to its grandest extreme. At the very top of the social scale, among the titled aristocracy, a widow's position followed its own distinct and highly formalized pattern, one shaped by centuries of accumulated custom around land and title, rather than the more modern professional wealth that had built Charles Ashford's own fortune. When a peer died, his widow became, in the formal language of the peerage, a dowager, a title that attached itself to her for the rest of her life, distinguishing her from whatever new wife her own son, now inheriting his father's title, might eventually marry. A dowager countess, a dowager duchess, a dowager viscountess, the word itself a permanent linguistic marker of her changed status, worn, in a sense, the way Adelaide wore her own printed calling cards, with the word relict attached to her name, though rather grander in its social weight. These aristocratic widows very often moved, following a husband's death, out of the grand principal family seat entirely and into a smaller residence called, quite literally, a dower house, a secondary property, sometimes genuinely comfortable and substantial in its own right, sometimes considerably more modest, that had been designated generations earlier, often written into the family's own inheritance customs, specifically for exactly this purpose, housing the widow of the previous title holder, while her son and his own new wife took up full residence in the main house. This custom, though it sounds, described plainly, like a genuine displacement, and in some ways certainly was exactly that, also reflected the same underlying legal logic we trace through Adelaide's own more modest version of it. Real property tied overwhelmingly to the title and its male heir, with a widow's own comfort and residence carefully, deliberately separated from that primary inheritance and provided for instead through a distinct secondary arrangement. Some dower houses were genuinely grand in their own right, substantial country houses in their own extensive grounds, and a dowager duchess with a generous jointure could live in her own dower house with nearly all the material comfort and social consequence she had enjoyed as the sitting duchess, hosting her own guests, maintaining her own considerable staff, wielding real ongoing influence within her family and her wider social circle for decades after her husband's death. Other dower houses, particularly in families whose fortunes had declined over the generations even as their titles remained intact, offered considerably less, leaving a dowager to manage a genuinely reduced and sometimes financially precarious existence despite the grandeur of the title she still, technically, carried. Adelaide, watching this world from her own considerably less exalted but genuinely comfortable position, has occasion over the years to observe it more directly than you might expect through Cecilia's own family connections, Henry's wife having a cousin who married into a minor title and became, in her own turn, a young dowager viscountess following her husband's unexpectedly early death. Adelaide corresponds with this young woman occasionally over the years, and finds, comparing notes across their very different social worlds, that the underlying emotional and practical shape of their two widowhoods carries more in common than the vast difference in their titles might suggest. The same sudden legal transformation, the same careful, elaborate mourning calendar, followed if anything with even greater public scrutiny, given the young viscountess's more prominent social position, the same complicated arithmetic of a fixed jointure measured against a household's ongoing needs, the same watchful family on both sides, and the same quiet, patient work of learning, from a standing start, how to actually manage money and property that had, for the entire span of her married life, simply belonged to conversations she had never been invited to join. What differs most sharply between the two women's experiences, Adelaide comes to feel, watching this younger woman's own widowhood unfold over correspondence stretching across several years, is not really the underlying legal architecture at all, which turns out to be remarkably similar in its basic shape, whether the property involved is a Belgravia townhouse or an ancestral country seat with its own dower house tucked discreetly at the edge of the grounds. What differs is scale and the particular weight of public visibility that comes with a title, the way an aristocratic widow's every choice, her mourning wardrobe, her eventual return to society, any hint of a second marriage, becomes a matter of interest not merely to her own family and social circle, but to newspapers and to a much wider public entirely disconnected from her actual private grief. Adelaide, reading occasional newspaper mentions of her young correspondent's own movements through society over the years, feels, more than once, a genuine private gratitude for the comparative obscurity of her own widowhood, free to build her own quiet independent life, without quite so many watching eyes recording its every stage. There is a particular kind of wisdom, I think, in seeing your own story reflected, however imperfectly, in someone else's very different circumstances, and Adelaide, corresponding with her young dowager acquaintance across those years, comes to understand her own widowhood more clearly precisely because she can see, in this other woman's more publicly visible version of the same underlying structure, the exact same forces that had shaped her own life, playing out at a different scale, under a brighter and less forgiving light. One more thread of this story deserves to be pulled gently into the light before we let everything settle, because it concerns the servants who spent their own working lives inside Adelaide's household, and I think their experience of all this change deserves a few honest minutes of its own. Perrin, the butler who once stood so steadily in the front hall on that first terrible morning, giving quiet instructions while a housemaid stopped the pendulum of the long-case clock, remains with Adelaide for nearly 20 years after Charles's death, following her from the grand Belgravia house into her own smaller establishment when she finally purchases it, a loyalty that Adelaide has always understood to be worth considerably more than the modest wages she is able to offer him in her reduced household. When Perrin himself finally retires, well into his 60s, his joints no longer equal to the physical demands of even a household as small as Adelaide's has become, she arranges for him a small pension, drawn from her own funds rather than from any formal household budget, a private arrangement she never discusses with anyone outside her own solicitor, ensuring that a man who spent decades keeping her household running smoothly through the worst and best years of her life will not himself end his days in the kind of precarious poverty that swallowed so many retired servants of his generation, men and women whose own working lives had given them no pension at all, beyond whatever small savings they had managed to set aside from wages that were never, in the best of times, especially generous. Mrs. Doyle, the cook, marries late in her own life, somewhat to everyone's surprise, a widowed grocer from a few streets over whom she meets, of all places, at the very market she has spent decades haggling over the price of vegetables with, and leaves service entirely to help run his shop, a departure Adelaide marks with genuine warmth and a wedding gift considerably more generous than strict custom required, a small acknowledgement of exactly how much of her own household's steady comfort across so many difficult years had rested on Mrs. Doyle's own quiet competence in that kitchen. I mention these smaller lives, Perrin's and Mrs. Doyle's, because I think it would be a genuine mistake to tell Adelaide's story as though her own hard-won independence existed in isolation, unconnected to the labour of the people who made that independence practically possible every single day. A widow managing her own household, however competently, however admirably, however hard she herself had to work to learn the skills that competence required, still stood at the top of a small domestic hierarchy built, in its own turn, on the far less visible and far less well-compensated labour of people like Perrin and Mrs. Doyle, whose own security in old age depended almost entirely on the individual kindness of an employer, rather than on any structural protection remotely comparable to the jointure and the settlement and the restraint upon anticipation that had shaped Adelaide's own far more comfortable widowhood. It is a detail worth sitting with quietly for a moment, the way most true things about history usually are, neither entirely comfortable nor entirely bleak, simply the honest, layered shape of how one household's fortune, however hard won, was always built on the foundation of several other, considerably more precarious lives running quietly alongside it. There is also, I think, something worth saying about the particular kind of woman Adelaide became in relation to money itself, apart from the family and household she managed. She develops over the decades a genuinely careful and thoughtful approach to her own eventual will, a document she revises twice across her later years as circumstances shift, taking a care with its drafting that stands in quiet, deliberate contrast to the will Charles himself left behind all those decades earlier, drawn up once, 9 years before his death, and never revised at all despite the substantial changes in the family's circumstances across those 9 years. Adelaide, having lived so directly with the consequences of a will drafted with the best intentions, but without any particular anticipation of how quickly circumstances might change, makes a private point every few years of sitting down with her own solicitor to review her arrangements afresh, adjusting a bequest here, updating a figure there, making entirely certain that the document governing her own eventual estate reflects, as closely as any legal instrument can, the actual current shape of the family she has spent so many years building and protecting. She leaves, in the final version of that will, careful and specific provisions not only for Henry and Louisa and their own children, but for Mrs. Thornbury's own surviving daughter, a woman Adelaide had watched grow up across all those Thursday afternoon teas, left with even less financial security than her own mother had once possessed. She leaves a meaningful sum to the charitable society supporting widows and orphans of the shipping and insurance trade that she had quietly supported for decades, and she leaves, tucked into a private letter meant only for her own family, rather than the formal will itself, a request that surprises no one who has known her across these later years. A simple wish that her granddaughters, and their own daughters in turn, be raised to understand their own financial affairs from the very beginning of their adult lives, rather than being left, as she herself once was, to learn everything at once in the worst possible week of their entire lives, because no one had ever thought to teach them any sooner. Let me bring you back one final time to Adelaide herself, because I think a story like this one deserves to end not with a law or a comparison, but with a person, sitting quietly somewhere, the way we found her at the very beginning. She lives on for many more years after that autumn evening, with jointure curled on the hearthrug, and Evelyn's small, serious face bent over a set of sums. She watches Henry's insurance business grow steadily under his own careful management, a business he runs, she notices with quiet approval, with exactly the same instinct for balancing risk against reward that his father once had, tempered by something gentler and more patient that Adelaide likes to think, in her more sentimental moments, might have come from watching his own mother manage far smaller sums with far greater care across his entire childhood. She watches Louisa's own daughters grow into young women considerably more comfortable discussing money openly than Adelaide herself had ever been permitted to be at their age, a small but real shift in the wider culture around her that she recognizes, with real satisfaction, as something she herself had a genuine hand in shaping. One careful marriage settlement clause, and one patient afternoon of arithmetic lessons at a time. The house in the square remains hers until the very end, that small, well-proportioned house she purchased outright at 45, with money that belonged, in the fullest and most complete sense, to no one but herself. She never remarries, though she remains, across all the decades of her widowhood, on genuinely warm terms with Mr. Whitfield, who does eventually marry again, some years after their own brief unrealized possibility quietly faded, to a widow considerably more inclined than Adelaide had been to hand her own financial affairs entirely into a new husband's keeping. Adelaide attends his second wedding, sits comfortably through the whole ceremony beside Mrs. Fenwick, her own mother, considerably older now, and long since reconciled to a daughter who chose independence over the more conventional security she had once hoped for her, and finds, watching the two of them exchange their vows, not a flicker of regret, only a warm, uncomplicated happiness for an old friend who has found exactly the kind of companionship he was always looking for, a companionship that simply, as it turned out, was never quite what Adelaide herself needed. There is a particular quality to the last years of a long, well-lived life, a settling, a slow gathering in of everything that came before into something closer to peace than to any single remaining ambition, and Adelaide's final years carry exactly this quality, unhurried, comfortable, surrounded by a family she helped shape into people considerably more financially literate, considerably more willing to speak plainly about money and property and independence than the family she herself was born into ever managed to be. She keeps her small garden until she is genuinely too frail to kneel among the rosebeds herself, at which point Henry's youngest daughter, who has developed, rather touchingly, her own budding passion for the same roses, takes over the actual physical labour while Adelaide sits nearby in a comfortable chair, directing with the easy, settled authority of a woman who has spent the better part of her adult life directing one thing or another, competently and completely, entirely on her own terms. She keeps her account book until nearly the very end too, the habit begun in that first raw spring of widowhood, never quite abandoned even when the sums involved have grown, over the decades, considerably more comfortable than the anxious calculations of her 39th year. There is something almost ceremonial by this point, in the way she sits down each month with her spectacles and her careful, still steady handwriting, reviewing figures that no longer carry any real anxiety at all, simply the quiet satisfaction of a life's work well tended, a small private ritual of competence that has outlasted every other habit from those first difficult months, except, perhaps, the small oval brooch she still, even now, pins most mornings close against her heart. I want to leave you, finally, with one more small image, because I think it captures something true about the whole long arc of this story, better than any further explanation could. It is a quiet afternoon, late in Adelaide's life, and Evelyn, grown now into a young woman herself, comes to visit her grandmother with a question. she is engaged to be married to a kind and steady young man of whom the whole family genuinely approves, and the marriage settlement negotiations have just begun. Her own father and the young man's solicitor working out the careful clauses that will govern her own financial future, the way such clauses have governed the financial future of every woman in this family for 3 generations now. Evelyn asks her grandmother, sitting together in the small familiar parlour with its low fire and its ticking mantel clock, what she should actually ask for, what protections actually matter, what a young woman entering marriage in this new century, so much freer already than the century Adelaide herself was born into, still genuinely needs to understand and insist upon for her own sake. And Adelaide, 80 years old now, her hands folded quietly in her lap, her hair entirely silver, but her eyes, Evelyn always thinks, exactly as sharp and exactly as attentive as they must have been on the very worst morning of her own life, all those decades ago, takes a long moment before she answers. She thinks, perhaps, of a housemaid stopping a pendulum with 2 careful fingers, of a small leather notebook filling, page by page, with unfamiliar figures, of a solicitor's kind, careful voice telling a grieving young widow that the details could wait until Thursday, of a railway crisis weathered, a daughter's marriage settlement fought for clause by clause, a small independent house purchased with money that belonged, at last, entirely and completely to herself. She tells her granddaughter simply that she should ask enough questions of enough people until she genuinely understands every single word of whatever document she is asked to sign, that she should never, under any circumstances, allow anyone, however kind, however well-meaning, however much they love her, to manage her own affairs without her full understanding and her own considered consent, and that whatever protection the law now offers her, considerably more than it ever offered Adelaide herself at the same age, she should still learn, for her own sake and for no one else's, exactly how her own money actually works. It is, Adelaide thinks, watching her granddaughter absorb this advice with the same serious, attentive expression she has carried since she was 9 years old, working through sums on the parlour floor, the truest inheritance she has to leave behind, truer in its own quiet way than any jointure or any life interest or any careful clause in any marriage settlement. Not money itself, though there will be some of that too, in time, when Adelaide's own considerable estate, built so slowly and so carefully across 4 decades of her own patient management, is finally divided among her children and her grandchildren, something more durable than money. The simple, hard-won knowledge that a woman's understanding of her own life, financial and otherwise, belongs to her alone, and that no one, however kind, should ever be allowed to hold it for her. There is one last piece of this I want to mention, because it has stayed with me since I first came across accounts of women like Adelaide, and I think it belongs here, in these final quiet pages of her story, rather than back among the drier legal details earlier in the evening. Historians who study this period sometimes describe what happened to women like Adelaide, using a phrase that sounds almost clinical when you first hear it, the feminization of widowhood as a site of legal agency, a dry academic way of naming something that was, for the actual women living through it, never abstract at all. It meant in practice exactly what we have spent tonight watching unfold inside one particular household on one particular square in London. A woman handed, through the worst possible door, a set of tools she had never been permitted to hold before, and then left, largely alone, to discover for herself whether she had the strength and the patience to actually learn how to use them. Not every widow discovered that strength. We have touched, tonight, on Mrs. Thornbury, whose own widowhood unfolded along a considerably harder and more anxious path, her husband's more modest and more carelessly arranged affairs offering her nowhere near the same cushion Adelaide's own careful settlement provided. We have touched, more briefly, on the vast unrecorded majority of Victorian widows further down the economic scale entirely, women for whom the whole elaborate apparatus of jointures and life interests and restraints upon anticipation simply never applied at all, because there had never been enough capital in the family to require such careful legal architecture in the first place. Adelaide's story, competent and eventually genuinely peaceful as it becomes, was always a story available only to a narrow slice of women fortunate enough to be born and to marry into families with the resources to protect them properly. It is worth remembering that, even as we sit tonight inside the warmth of her own particular happy ending, and yet I do not think that fact makes her story any less worth telling, or any less worth resting inside for one more quiet evening before you finally drift off to sleep. Every individual life, however typical or however privileged its circumstances, still had to be lived one single day at a time by one single person, working out, often entirely alone, exactly how to survive a loss that arrived without warning and reshaped everything around her in a single silent hour. Adelaide's particular tools were better than most. Her own patience, her own hard-won competence, her own quiet insistence, across 4 decades, on understanding every clause of every document that ever governed her own life. Those things were entirely her own, built by her, day after unremarkable day, out of nothing more than a schoolgirl's notebook and a steady, stubborn refusal to remain as ignorant of her own affairs as the world around her had always assumed she would be content to stay. I think of her sometimes as standing at the very edge of one world and the very beginning of another, one foot still planted in the old rigid architecture of coverture and dower and entail, the other already testing the ground of something newer, something closer to the fuller legal independence her own granddaughters would eventually take almost entirely for granted. She did not choose that particular vantage point. Nobody chooses the exact historical moment their own grief happens to arrive in. But she made, I think, genuinely good use of the strange, narrow, hard-won freedom that moment handed her, and that, more than any specific sum of money or any specific clause in any specific document, feels to me like the truest thing this whole long evening has had to say. The light in the parlour window fades slowly toward evening, the way it always does at this hour, and somewhere in the house a clock strikes the quarter hour with the same steady, unhurried rhythm it has kept for as long as anyone in this family can now remember. Adelaide sits quietly with her granddaughter a while longer, the conversation drifting, as such conversations do, towards smaller and gentler things, the wedding flowers, the guest list, a particular rose Adelaide once cut and brought into the church, and the whole long, unlikely, hard-won shape of her own independent life settles, for one more quiet evening, into exactly the kind of peace she once could not have imagined possible, sitting in a darkened bedroom nearly 60 years earlier, a stopped clock somewhere below her, a husband's hand growing slowly cold in her own, and an entire unknown future waiting, whether she was ready for it or not, just beyond the closed door. I think that is where we can leave her tonight, love. Not at the beginning, with all its shock and its silence, and not even at the very end, whenever that quietly eventually came, but somewhere comfortably in the middle of her own long peace, a fire low in the grate, a granddaughter beside her, a garden going gently to sleep outside the window, and a whole life, finally, entirely, unmistakably her own. There is no dramatic final scene to give you, no deathbed moment to close this particular story properly, and I think that is, in its own quiet way, exactly right. Adelaide's story was never really about its ending. It was about all those unremarkable Tuesdays in between, the ledgers and the roses and the quiet, patient accumulation of a competence nobody ever expected her to need. Whatever her own final years eventually looked like, whenever her own last quiet evening finally arrived, she had already, by the time we leave her here, built everything that actually mattered, a life entirely her own, held together not by any husband's protection, but by her own 2 steady hands. The house settles into its evening quiet now, the way houses do. Somewhere upstairs, a bed is being warmed and turned down. Somewhere in the garden, the last of the light is fading gently into blue. And somewhere in that small, comfortable room, an old woman who once knew nothing at all about the shape of her own fortune sits surrounded by the family she raised, the independence she built, and the quiet, settled certainty of a life she came, in the end, to genuinely call her own. If you have made it this far with me tonight, I hope some small part of Adelaide's slow, patient, unglamorous competence stays with you as you drift off. Not the grief, though the grief was real, and not even the money, though the money mattered more than anyone in her own century was ever quite willing to admit out loud. Just the quiet, steady image of a woman learning, one careful figure at a time, exactly how to hold her own life in her own 2 hands. Sleep well, friend. We have been somewhere real tonight.